Hey friends, tonight we're curling up with a quiet old story from a cold November in Scotland. Dim the lights, get comfy. If you've got tea, that's excellent life management. If you don't, water is fine. We're not judging. Let your shoulders drop a little. If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Always kind of sweet to think of us scattered across time zones doing the world's slowest book club together. If bedtime history is your thing, you can hit subscribe. No pressure, we'll be here either way. So, the Black Dinner of 1440. People like to say it inspired a certain scene in later literature, and yes, that's the one you're thinking of. But the real story is quieter than popular versions, and stranger, because the strange part is how normal it seemed to the people arranging it. This is a tale of a boy king with too many adult handlers, a teenage earl with too much land, and a political culture that treated hospitality like a sacred law, until it didn't. We're in 15th century Scotland. It's chilly. Everyone has a title, several surnames, and a feud. King James II is a child. He's a crown with freckled cheeks, to put it gently. He became king at 6 after his father, James I, was assassinated in 1437. That was very on-brand for the period, which loved a dramatic succession crisis almost as much as it loved a well-fortified rock. Because the king is a child, real power is in the hands of regents, guardians, and whoever can stand closest to the treasury without looking obvious. Two names matter a lot right now. Sir William Crichton, the Chancellor of Scotland and keeper of Edinburgh Castle, and Sir Alexander Livingston of Callander, who controls Stirling Castle and, crucially, sometimes the royal person. These two play a years-long game of who's got the king today. It's basically medieval shared custody, but with more armor and fewer mediation sessions.
Hovering over all of this is the Douglas family, the Black Douglases, to be exact, as opposed to their cousins, the Red Douglases, aka the Earls of Angus. The Black Douglases are the heavyweights. Their lands stretch across southern Scotland like a wool blanket somebody refused to fold. They have castles, revenues, and a private army large enough to make any chancellor check the bolts on his doors twice. When the crown is weak, the Douglases tend to be very confident. Of course they do. Meet William Douglas, 6th Earl of Douglas. He's about 16. He inherited young because medieval lifespans were generous in stories and rude in practice. William is rich on paper and powerful in theory, but he's still a teenager. His younger brother, David, is around 14. These boys are highborn, well-dressed, and raised to think the world has rules. Hospitality, honor, oaths, the usual medieval playlist. And that's the vulnerability right there. They assume everyone else believes in the rules as much as they do. Let's float over to the idea of hospitality for a second because it matters. In late medieval Scotland, inviting someone under your roof as your guest at your table meant you were responsible for their safety. It wasn't just etiquette. It had the weight of sacred custom. Priests preached it. Bards sang it. Breaking it stamped you as outside the club of civilized people. So if you're the type who wants to remove a rival without open battle, you have a dilemma. You can't just oops someone at dinner without ruining your reputation. Unless, of course, you decide that your need is bigger than the rule, and you wrap your decision in enough legal words and political theater to make it feel almost procedural. It says something about this period that men convinced themselves of that with straight faces. Back to our cast. Sir William Crichton, the Chancellor, is older than the Douglas boys and very practiced in the arts of survival. He's the cautious type who counts knives in a kitchen, keeper of Edinburgh Castle, helpful when you like walls, and he's got the king in his orbit often enough to shape the boys' day. Livingston is a rival and occasional ally, as suits the week. Queen Joan Beaufort, the king's mother, is in the background with her own priorities. All of them care about stability, which in their minds often means make sure no single noble family is bigger than the crown. Guess which family was bigger than the crown? Yes, the Douglases. The boys were a symbol of it. Before the dinner, there's years of mild chaos. Tug-of-war with the king's custody, confiscations, alliances signed, alliances broken. A regency is a basic problem. Everyone claims to act for the king while using the king to act for themselves. The teenagers, they're out in the borders where the Douglas lands give you local influence, income, and the kind of household that makes other households nervous. William is told he's a problem without being shown very workable alternatives, because subtlety is not the strong suit of Chancery memos.
There's also this useful piece of symbolism people love to talk about, a black bull's head brought to table as a sign of death. It's one of those details that could be legendary, could be real, and is probably somewhere in between. Chroniclers write it down decades later, and stories like it have a way of improving with age. Either way, the meaning would have been clear if it happened. Doom is served. Not exactly subtle. But they weren't aiming for subtle. We should say a word about sources. The basics are widely agreed. The Douglas boys, William and David, were invited to Edinburgh Castle in 1440. A ceremony or feast occurred. There was a sudden charge of treason, a quick trial, and then execution. Who exactly orchestrated it, who exactly stood where, and whether the king consented or simply repeated lines he'd been fed are debated. Crichton is traditionally blamed, often with Livingston implicated, and sometimes the Queen Mother is mentioned, which, to be honest, tracks with the way power worked. It was a group project where everyone wanted their name missing from the final poster. So how did two teenagers end up walking into all that? Because invitation etiquette was real currency, because refusing a royal summons looked worse than accepting it, because the young sometimes assume that everyone older in the room is playing the same game, and because a major noble family cannot act frightened without losing face. William is 16, which is old enough to sign charters and young enough to believe adults aren't planning an execution in a banquet hall. David is 14. He knows how to dance a pavane and not spill sauce on his sleeves. He does not know how to read chancellors the way chancellors read him. Picture the approach. The road to Edinburgh in late autumn. Short daylight, slippery ruts. The castle up on its rock like a ship parked on stone. The city below it busy with market noise and the smell of everything. Tallow, smoke, malt, wet wool. The Douglas party approaches with a trimmed retinue because you don't bring an army to a dinner. They're greeted at the gates with the formality due their rank. Crichton makes polite noises. He's very good at those. The young king is present, small and careful, the way children are when they know the grown-ups are tense.
The etiquette will have been textbook. Horses taken, quarters provided, servants briefed on what to touch and what not to touch. The castle is in feast mode. Tapestries up, rushes renewed, silver out. People who know how to pour and carry glide through the hall. It's all very soothing if you forget the politics, and for a little while that's the point. The performance of friendship is meant to work. It usually did. Across Europe for centuries, this elaborate dance of welcome made enemies and allies and rivals into in-laws. One dinner could change fortunes. Of course, this one will too, just not in the cozy way. Let's float briefly to the boy at the center of all this, King James II. He's around 10, going on 11. He has strong caretakers and weak autonomy. Later in life, he'll be decisive to the point of, let's call it overcorrection. He's the one who will literally kill an adult Douglas with his own hands in 1452. Yes, really. And he will die in 1460 when a giant cannon explodes during a siege, which is a very medieval way to go. For now, he is a child among adults who stage manage his words. He probably understood the theater of it all more than people assumed. Children are good at feeling the temperature of a room even when they don't know the script. Back to the Douglases. William is 16 and tall enough to look like an earl across a table, but too young to have that crease between the eyebrows that says, "You've survived 6 council winters." He's accompanied by his brother David, who is not old enough to shave consistently and still startled by ceremonial trumpets. They are greeted warmly. They're given places of honor. The meal is abundant, because it always is in royal spaces: bread, fish, roasted meats, spiced sauces to remind you that someone paid for far-off ships to bring cinnamon the slow way. The band plays. The conversation hums. The older men watch. The younger ones try to appear at ease. We should spend a moment on why the Douglases were such a problem for the Regency. It wasn't personal, not purely, it was structural. When a realm is led by a minor, any single family with enough land, men, and money can effectively veto royal policy by ignoring it. It makes governance exhausting. If William Douglas grows into his titles and decides not to be cooperative, if he raises his banner and invites neighbors to join in, then the regents have a civil war. If he's cooperative, great, but that's not a long-term plan. Men like Crichton and Livingston want the room to be smaller, the table to be their size. Getting the Douglases to shrink themselves voluntarily was never going to happen. So they reach for the bluntest instrument, wrapped in table linen.
Before the feast, there will have been weeks of messaging. Letters sent, intermediaries, hints that the Douglases should show loyalty by showing up, advisors murmuring that attending would be wise, other advisors, these are the ones you listen to later, suggesting that wise can be a synonym for risky, especially when your host owns a castle and a title with keys in it. The choice set before William really is simple: accept and demonstrate respect, or refuse and look like a rebel. He accepts. He has to. He is 16 and sitting on a mountain of family prestige. He chooses ceremony. He chooses trust. Now, a quick aside on the black bull's head. You'll see it repeated everywhere. A black head brought out on a trencher is supposed to be the sign that the honored guest is actually the doomed guest. Was that really what happened? It might have been. It might have been added by a chronicler who liked symbolism. Either way, the image stuck because it fits the mood of the era. People pretending politeness until the moment they don't need to anymore. Medieval Scotland didn't invent that move. It just embroidered it with antlers. The king's part in the evening is painfully awkward in most accounts. He speaks when prompted. He watches adults do adult things. He may have believed the accusations he was made to read. He may simply have read them. The distinction matters to us now. It mattered less to men making choices that night. What matters for the long echo is that a child king was used to destroy child nobles. If you're writing a parable about the dangers of power without conscience, you don't need to change a thing. Meanwhile, outside the Great Hall, the city goes about its business. Brewers brew, a notary scratches in the margin of the charter. A woman sells onions and listens to rumors, because that's how you survive and plan your winter stores. In the castle kitchens, hands are busy, because a castle eats like a village. Somebody is annoyed about a sauce curdling. Somebody else eyes the clockwork of service and thinks, this feels staged. But it's a castle. Everything feels staged. That's the point. Let's talk about the two main architects again, Crichton and Livingston, without turning them into mustache twirlers. Both had their reasons. Crichton, the chancellor, was in the business of preserving a government that worked around him, naturally. Livingston, more soldierly, wanted control of the king's person and feared any family who could pluck that control away with a few hundred horses. They'd both seen what happened when major magnates went their own way. Borders sliding into reading, taxes evaporating, legislation mocked. None of that excuses murdering teenagers at dinner. It explains the mental gymnastics by which men convinced themselves this was, quote-unquote, necessary. If you're thinking, so the justification was basically ends justify means, but in wool, yes, exactly that. As for the Douglases' advisors, they were split.
Some counseled caution, smelling the trap through the perfume of court. Others said refusing would be tantamount to declaring war, and war would be fought on ground chosen by your enemies. The younger earls in stories always choose honor. William is no different. He goes, he brings his brother, he tries to be stately about it. He wants to believe in the glue that's supposed to hold noble society together. He had been told about honor since he could hold a spoon. Of course he thinks it will protect him when he's holding a knife and fork. Now we're in the hall. There's music, there's wine. People tell the same court jokes they always tell, laughing gently. The king lifts a cup with both hands. Crichton watches the room like a theater manager. The Douglas boys eat more politely than they want to. Servants step and turn in neat lines. A chronicler later will say a head was brought out, black and heavy, and placed before the Douglases on a trencher. If you were there, maybe you saw it. Maybe you only saw the closing of doors. Maybe what you remember are the sounds that belong in a hall, the scrape of chair legs, the breath of a draft over candles, and the sudden absence of normality that doesn't have a sound at all. We'll keep it calm, no gory recounting. The important thing for us is the structure. A royal invitation, hospitality extended, charges raised, a swift judicial performance, and 2 boys executed within the castle's reach. The machine worked because trust existed, and it worked because people counted on it. That's the paradox. The law of hospitality made a perfect weapon precisely because it was supposed to be unbreakable. You don't brace for something that never happens until it does.
And that's why the Black Dinner sits in memory the way it does. It isn't just that 2 young nobles died. Death was common currency. It's that their murder under protection, under the visible roof of the king, broke something you can't easily repair. After this, nobles think twice before sending their sons to court, before answering letters, before accepting a cup. The glue of society weakens, a millimeter at a time. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just thinner. Let's soften our gaze for a moment and step outside again. The wind off the Firth of Forth has that damp bite that gets into wool and bone. Down the slope, people don't hear the words spoken in the hall. Tomorrow, they'll hear different versions from different mouths. Some will be furious at the violation. Some will say it was practical, even clever. Most will shrug with that old, tired shrug people use when the powerful do what the powerful do. History loves a big scene. Bedsides prefer the quiet churn underneath. How a boy king learned that a crown is a costume until you grow into it. How a cautious chancellor decided that necessity was kinder than chaos. It wasn't. How a teenage earl walked into a castle because not walking in would have made him look guilty. And how a ritual as simple as come to dinner turned into a parable that generations would point to when they wanted to explain what went wrong in a whole political culture. We'll stop here in the soft part of the story, with the candles still steady and the platters still warm, the castle audible in that low-way stone breeze at night. Next time we'll drift through what followed, the immediate fallout, the furious Douglases who remained, the boy king growing older in the shadow of what adults made him do, and the long echo that eventually brought Scotland to more reckonings, more dinners, and finally to one very ill-fated cannon. For now, just breathe, set down the weight of the day. History can hold this one while you rest.
Welcome back. If you're still awake, that's impressive. If you're drifting, that's honestly the point. Let's sink a little deeper into that hall on the rock and let the noise of the modern world fade out to a very quiet clink of medieval silver. We left the Douglas boys at the high table, William at 16, David at 14. 2 young men raised in rooms with tapestries and advice, fluent in the careful languages of courtesy and obligation. The band plays, the drink moves, the hall warms. This could be any royal evening. And then, slowly, it isn't. In most tellings, the change is noticed by the quiet people first, The servants don't look like servants anymore. The doors that should breathe open and shut are just closed. The air forgets how to carry laughter. A boy king is nudged to stand up a little straighter. A chancellor arranges his face into something between sorrow and official resolve. People who know how to keep their eyes on the table, keep their eyes on the table. The famous detail, of course, is the black bull's head brought to the Douglases' setting on a trencher. Some sources love that image, some shrug and say it's a later flourish, added by storytellers who understood what a good symbol does for a bad night. Either way, everyone sitting there didn't need a prop to read what was about to happen. The performance of friendship was over. The performance of justice was about to start. We won't dwell. No need to rehearse the script loudly. What matters is the shape of the thing. Charges are declared. Treason. It's the kind of word that does most of the heavy lifting by itself. In a minority reign, treason can mean everything and nothing. Raising men without permission, being too rich for comfort, talking to the wrong neighbor at harvest time. Treason is the drawer you put any sharp thing in when you don't want to leave it on the table. Was there a trial? There was something trial-shaped. A swift, formal passage of words. Perhaps a few rehearsed testimonies. The law put on its best cloak and walked past, just long enough to be seen. And then the boys were led out into the courtyard. Some chroniclers say Malcolm Fleming of Cumbernauld, guardian and ally to the young Earl, was taken too. Many versions have him executed alongside them. The point lands the same way. The House of Douglas was being told to be smaller by nightfall. And this is the part that lodges under the ribs of memory. Hospitality had been extended. That roof had been offered. In the moral grammar of the time, that mattered. You could beat your rival in battle with minimal reputational damage. You could sue him into a corner. You could even ambush him in the heather and turn it into a ballad if you did it neatly. But killing a guest? Under your roof? Even if you smothered it in legal language, even if you intoned "for the safety of the realm until the candles burned down," people felt the shape of the violation. They didn't have to be Douglases to feel it. They just had to be potential guests. As for the boy king, he's the problem you don't fix with proclamations. Did he understand his lines? Was he a willing part of it? It's one of those questions historians answer with elegant hand gestures and a quiet, "It's complicated." He was small. He was surrounded by older men who believed they were rescuing a government from chaos. He would grow into someone who took decisions sharply and personally. But in that moment, he was a child you could put a crown on like a hat and move with a hand on his shoulder.
And so, in the darkness of the courtyard, a sentence was carried out. The castle walls heard what castle walls always hear. People in the town below slept through it, or didn't. The next day, no one had to invent explanations. They had them ready. It was necessary, it was high time, it was unforgivable, it was clever. The truth was narrow, and the reactions were wide. Let's walk slowly into the immediate after. The news moves fast because it always does when it's about fear. The Douglas household beyond the castle learns by whispers, then by shouting, then by messengers trying to sound composed. Men decide to ride or to wait. Women decide who to hide and where. Priests decide which sermon won't get them into trouble. The air in the borders sharpens. And then, something that feels almost like a plot twist if you're expecting a clean moral arc. The earldom of Douglas doesn't vanish into the snow. It doesn't go back into royal hands for good. It slides sideways along the family tree. The title passes to James Douglas of Balvenie. He's the dead boy's great-uncle. People call him James the Gross. Gross here meaning large, comfortable, substantial. Not a judgment so much as a shape. Imagine a powerful ledger upholstered in velvet who knows every entry by heart. He becomes the 7th Earl. Some contemporaries wondered, aloud and with pointed facial expressions, whether James the Gross was really all that displeased about the way things unfolded. If Crichton needed a noble Douglas who wouldn't fight him to the death, a senior kinsman with fewer teenage impulses fit nicely. Was there collusion? Direct, indirect, or just the kind of mutually useful silence men learn in long hallways? We don't have a signed confession, we have probabilities wrapped in convenience, which, in royal politics, is practically standard stationery.
James the Gross sets about being reasonable. Reasonable meaning willing to deal. He takes charters. He accepts settlements. He avoids setting the borders on fire immediately. The regents get to say that the dangerous problem, two young magnates with too much swagger, has been solved. The new earl gets to ensure the Douglas machine keeps rolling. Everyone who engineered the dinner gets to sleep a little better. For a year or two, possibly 3. This is the part where the lesson is that if you try to fix a structural problem with a stunt, the structure notices. You've broken trust. You haven't repaired the beams. Meanwhile, the Crichton-Livingston relationship frays the way complicated alliances always do. They had worked together to remove dangerous variables. The variables now look different. The rivalry that existed before puts its shoes back on. Sir Alexander Livingston had control of Stirling, and often of the King's Day. Crichton held Edinburgh and the machinery of government. Both men genuinely believed they were essential. Both were correct in the short term. Neither was building something that could survive a confident adult monarch. Queen Joan Beaufort drifts through this part of the story like a quiet storm front. Widow of James I, politically capable, she had married again, in 1439, to James Stuart, the Black Knight of Lorne. That didn't go over flawlessly with the Regency clique. At one point, Livingston seized her at Stirling and made very sure she wouldn't interfere with his custody arrangements. This is the era. Everyone is everyone's hostage if they sit in the wrong chair on the wrong afternoon. Courtiers practice the art of smiling around gag orders. Back at Douglas HQ, the household adjusts to the new Earl's girth and gravity. He is not a friendly uncle. He is a strategic uncle who does sums in his head while you're talking. He's also mortal. He dies in 1443 after only a brief tenure. And with that, the balance tips again, because the title now lands on the shoulders of his son, another William. William Douglas, 8th Earl of Douglas. He is not built like a ledger. He is built like an intention. Tall, imperious, confident. If the Black Dinner had been aimed at permanently reducing Douglas' power, the effect was more like a pause button. Release the pause. The music starts up again. Louder.
Let's gently hold that contrast. In 1440, men staged a dinner to eliminate a problem boy and his brother. In 1443, they have to deal with a grown man with allies, money, and a memory. The 8th Earl makes bonds with other heavy hitters, the Earl of Crawford in the east, and, more dangerously, the Lord of the Isles out in the west. These bonds are formalized in neat documents called Bonds of Manrent, which is medieval for, we're best friends and we will make it your problem. If you're King James II, watching these alliances knit themselves while you're still putting on height, you start planning your adult personality. Before we get there, it's worth pausing over the emotional weather of the court after 1440. The boy king grows into a teenager with a streak of iron under the freckle. He has a birthmark. Later people will call him Fiery Face because medieval nicknames love a visual. He remembers being used. He remembers rooms closing around him. He is learning to use rooms the way they were used against him. That's not a therapy plan. It is, however, a governance plan. He will marry Mary of Guelders in 1449, and she will bring money, Dutch sturdiness, and a better grasp of long games. But right now, he's collecting names and tallying favors. He is observing the Douglases. What about Parliament in all this? It met, it voted, it wrote down laws that sounded very certain and were obeyed with variable enthusiasm. The chronic administrative problem remained. When the central state is weak, noble power pours into the cracks. You can almost hear Crichton reassuring himself that his dinner solution was prevented forces in advance. It wasn't.
It was delayed maintenance with extra consequences. Let's leave the fighting for later and take a softer look at reputation, because that's the real currency here. Crichton's name is welded to the Black Dinner forever. Livingston's usually comes along for the ride. Queen Joan's is sometimes attached by rumor. James the Gross sits in that chill corner reserved for relatives who benefit from funerals a little too neatly. The 8th Earl strides in looking like the answer to a question nobody should have asked. And the child in the crown grows into a man who will not forget that grown men once used his hand to sign death.
Another small, not quite funny irony. The violation of hospitality in 1440 made hospitality more valuable, not less. After that night, every safe conduct letter got heavier. Every invitation needed footnotes. You can't run a political society when everyone assumes the bread is poisoned, so people doubled down on signs and seals and rituals. Rings were kissed, oaths multiplied, lamps were left burning on thresholds. Did it help? Sometimes. When people want to believe, ceremony works. When they don't, even gold wax looks cheap. Down at the borders, the Douglas tenants kept doing what tenants do. They paid, they complained, they tried to keep sheep alive through the kind of winter that tells you which roofs were repaired in time. Very few of them ever saw the inside of a great hall. Very many of them felt the consequences of decisions taken there. It's unfashionable to say in a story like this, but most people in 1440 didn't care which magnate had the prettier charter, so long as nobody burned their stackyard. The Black Dinner taught them that even that modest request could be too much to ask. Some later writers like to drape the story with ghosts. You can see why. 2 boys led into a dark yard, a castle that still stands, a king with nightmares he doesn't talk about. In ballads and in quiet talks by hearths, people will always supply the rest. That's not history so much as it is the brain trying to tuck morality into the duvet. Did people report seeing the Douglas brothers at night? Of course someone did. After a breach that spectacular, the conscience of a nation takes on a silhouette. Whether the ghosts are real or not is almost beside the point. The real haunting is the change in behavior. The legal ripples were just as telling. The Regency government did its standard thing. Confirmed the executions as lawful, redistributed some lands, soothed some ruffled caps with grants. Then they tried to get back to governing on Mondays as if nothing kinetic had happened on Friday. But the new Earl of Douglas in a few years would not play along. If anything, the Black Dinner had selected for a more formidable opponent, not a softer one. It's the political equivalent of pruning a rosebush and growing thorns.
And because bedtime stories like a quiet callback, note the echo that will arrive in 1452. Another dinner, another invitation, this time at Stirling. The 8th Earl will be the guest. The adult King James will be the host. The king will ask the earl to break his alliances. The earl will say no. The king will do something visceral that has kept illustrators employed for centuries. We'll handle it gently when we get there. For now, just notice the symmetry. What you learn as a child, you sometimes rewrite as an adult. In the original theater, with your own lines. We should also restore one more person to the stage before we dim the lanterns. Bishop, later Archbishop, James Kennedy of St. Andrews. He's coming soon. Calm, educated, fiscally literate, and allergic to melodrama. He will help shape James II's kingship in the later 1440s with something like competence, which is always the least cinematic role and the most useful one. He will not dig up the ghosts of 1440 to flog them in public. He will try to make a system that doesn't require dinners at all to solve policy problems. Radical. So where does Part 2 leave us? With a castle that holds its secrets, a regency that believes it has done something necessary, a noble house that refuses to be edited out of the script, and a boy looking at a crown in a mirror and deciding to grow into it with sharp edges. The Black Dinner did not end a dynasty. It made its next chapter angrier. It did not settle the realm. It taught people how unsettled they could afford to be. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. If you're still with me, take a breath. The wind off the rock is colder now, and the hall is quiet again,
the trestles cleaned, the rushes replaced. Outside, in the town, someone wakes early to light a fire. In the borders, a steward counts rents and pretends not to listen for distant hooves. Somewhere on the coast, a ship sets out with wool and hopes for weather. History keeps walking with steady feet.
Next time, we'll drift through the rise of the 8th Earl, the king's careful pivot from watched boy to watching man, the slow collapse of trust between Crown and Douglas, and that second dinner where the roles reverse. No rush, we'll go softly. For now, stay warm. Let the rock fade out. Let the silence hold.
Hey again. If you've made tea, good. If not, just exhale slowly and pretend you did. We're walking very quietly into 1452 now. Different table, different host, same old problem. A crown trying to be bigger than a house that had been big for a very long time. You remember where we left things. The Regency years faded, James II grew into his own outline, Mary of Gelders arrived with calm money and calm competence. Bishop Kennedy stacked tidy ideas in the king's head like clean ledgers on a shelf. And William Douglas, 8th Earl of Douglas, came back from a Jubilee trip to Rome with a more expensive conscience and the exact same number of castles. It's a careful moment. The crown is not weak anymore. The Black Douglases are not either. The bonds William has been writing to other heavyweights, the Earl of Crawford in the northeast, the Lord of the Isles out west, are velvet ropes that create a private lounge inside the kingdom. From a royal point of view, that looks less like friendship and more like a parallel universe, two governments sharing one realm. That never ends quietly. So, the king tries the reasonable thing first. Messages, invitations, meetings. We're in Stirling now, not Edinburgh. The rock is still high. The wind still remembers the same tune. The messenger says the right phrases. The safe words are probably said too. Safe conduct appears in some versions, others are cagey. The details were fluid even as the ink dried. What matters is the expectation. William Douglas is asked to come to Stirling. He does. Because refusing a royal summons still reads like a provocation, and because people like to pretend trust is a renewable resource. The hall at Stirling is set out with the appropriate slow ceremony. Not ostentation. Control. Wood, polished until it glows. Tapestries that take the echo out of the air. Servants who know how to walk without squeaking. The king, not a boy anymore, is not behaving like a hostage in his own scene. He stands where he chooses. He sits when he wants. He has the bishop on one side and a future on the other. Mary is not far away. Neither is the memory of 1440.
Here's the quiet center of the evening. The king asks the earl to abandon his bonds. Not all of them at once, if you believe the kinder versions, but the big ones. Crawford, the Isles, the architecture of an alternative authority. Break them, the king says. Maybe as a command, maybe as an invitation to loyalty. Either way, the instruction lands like a hammer wrapped in velvet. William says no. The words differ in the chronicles, but the sense is consistent. He will not break what he has sworn. There's a way to hear that line as principled. There's a way to hear it as defiant. James hears it the second way. He hears a magnate telling a king that other obligations are larger than the crown. It pushes the same bruise pressed in 1440. And James had spent a decade deciding not to be that child again. The next moment is one of those blurry beats that later writers love, each choosing their angle. Some say James, in a flash, grabs a dagger and strikes. Some say he leaves, returns with a storm in his face, and the room's temperature drops sharply. Some emphasize that others in the chamber finish what the king started. All of the versions agree on where we end up. William Douglas, 8th Earl, dies inside Stirling Castle. There is no public judicial procession to steady anyone's conscience, no crispy Latin to explain why this is fine, actually. A guest comes, a guest dies, and a story we thought Scotland might have learned from repeats itself in a harsher key. We won't dwell on the mechanics. We keep it quiet here. What matters is the second breach of the thing you're not supposed to breach – hospitality again. This time the king's hand is the hand. If there was a safe conduct formalized in writing, then the letter was torn in spirit, if not in court. If there wasn't, many still felt the implied promise of safety when a ruler invites a subject to supper. The optics were uncooperative regardless. The reaction was instant and complicated. Some in a royal circle probably exhaled. The great problem had been removed, finally! The crown could breathe. Others knew better. The 8th Earl had brothers. He had kinsmen. He had clients whose livelihoods depended on Douglas largesse. Up and down the firm spine of Scotland, men who had eaten Douglas tables pushed their chairs back and stood up.
The new leader of the house is James Douglas, the 9th Earl. He has all the family's anger and none of James the Gross's appetite for compromise. He treats James II's dagger like a starting pistol. The Douglas rebellion that follows isn't a flood at first. It's more like a series of disciplined rains, but the ground was already saturated. It spreads. Turn your head gently to the northeast. The Earl of Crawford, Alexander Lindsay, the Tiger, steps into the circle as promised. He makes it a fight. The Crown answers not by sending the king personally, but by sending George Gordon, Earl of Huntly, a northern counterweight with a long memory and heavy boots. The two meet in May 1452 at Brechin. We're not going to pitch you a battle scene. Just know the result. Huntly wins. The Tiger loses more than a field. He loses the aura that said Douglas alliance equals invincibility. For James II, that's the kind of quiet news that makes breakfast taste better. Elsewhere, something even more delicate happens. The Lord of the Isles, whose alliance with Douglas had given this whole arrangement a coastal swagger, begins to recalibrate. He has his own kingdom to be concerned with and a lot of boats to keep busy. He watches which way the wind is truly blowing. Which is to say, he remembers that the monarchy can be petty, but it can also be persistent. The 9th Earl refuses to stand down. You can admire the consistency even as you mark it unwise. He calls out vassals. He rattles every tower door that says Douglas in stone. He wants the crown to back up, and he wants it publicly. James II does not back up. He leans in. The bishop smiles thinly and produces legal language that makes the leaning tidy. Gradually, the big pieces move. The king takes castles where he can. He surrounds the ones he can't take quickly with something new in Scottish royal kit – improved artillery. He had been building a park of guns, some purchased with Burgundian connections and gilders' money, some cast at home as the craft improved. He likes them a lot. You'll hear people say obsessed. We're being gentle. Let's call it enthusiastic. It matters now. Walls that had laughed at ladders were less amused by iron.
In the west, Threave looms on its island, pretending to be immortal. It isn't. Not even stone is when the siege is patient and the payroll is steady. There are stories of bribes, deals, quiet conversations with gatekeepers who valued a pension more than they valued drama. However it happens, Threave eventually becomes a royal property. The Douglas estate map begins to look like moths had a conservative snack. One by one, the house's anchors loosen. There's a moment at Abercorn in early 1455 that tells you everything you need to know. The 9th Earl gathers to confront the king. He's counting on the old reflexes, men who cheer for his banner because their fathers did. Instead, he discovers that long service is not immune to short patience. His support frays. He falls back. The psychology of following shifts.
often on the turn of a boot heel, not a paragraph. Then, the hinge. A crisp spring day by the River Esk near Langholm, Arkinholm, May 1455. Again, we won't beat a drum. The Royalist force, significantly fronted by the Red Douglases of Angus, delightful cousins with an excellent sense of advantageous timing, meets a Black Douglas contingent. The 9th Earl isn't there. His brothers are. Archibald, Earl of Moray, Hugh of Ormond, John of Balvenie may be nearby. The fight ends as these fights end, when a great name has lost its gravitational pull. One brother is killed, another is captured and executed soon after. The third escapes south. The Red Douglases and their friends carry the day with the untroubled energy of kin who will swap your seat after dessert if it helps the family name stay in the room. Parliament does what parliaments are for. It meets, it declares, it forfeits. In June 1455, the 9th Earl of Douglas is formally out. Lands are redistributed with the brisk efficiency of a clerk who writes quickly and sleeps well. The crown reclaims a kingdom inside the kingdom. A handful of old enemies nod and pretend they helped. The Red Douglases of Angus collect their rewards. Other houses that had picked the right moment to be loyal get theirs too. The Black Douglases, a century of swagger, are effectively erased as a political force in Scotland.
It's hard to overstate the structural change that follows without making it sound like a TED Talk. The royal government, after a generation of being a suggestion, becomes something stickier. The court system feels more like a path and less like a rumor. Sheriffs hedge fewer bets. Collectors collect. Castles that had been pronounced too strong to bother with have cannon scratches on their faces. The idea that one family can create a state within the state loses its charm. People try again in future decades. It doesn't land the same way. There is a clean narrative people like here. The Black Dinner taught a bad lesson, the king repeated it, the house rose, the king finished it, balance restored. It's clean. It's also a bit smug. The cost was not small. Every time hospitality is used as a weapon, the next invitation gets heavier. After 1452, courts across Scotland practiced extra piety about safe conduct, not because they suddenly discovered ethics, but because running a political society with poisoned bread is exhausting. The king had become the man who killed a guest to settle a question. He won the question. He did not erase the memory. How did James II wear that? Competently. He was not a brooder in public. He preferred action to sad sermons. He pushed into the borders to make royal authority look normal again. He smiled at Mary's well-run household because well-run households are quietly revolutionary. He listened to Kennedy counting the ways you can make a central government feel ordinary again. He ordered more guns. He liked their obedience. Metal doesn't hesitate when you call for it. The Douglases didn't vanish into the ether. The 9th Earl went to England. He did what exiled magnates do, hoovered on a foreign frontier, wrote letters, made promises, and waited for cracks that never widened enough. A few Black Douglas partisans made their peace, a few vanished. The name lingered, stripped of its old lightning. The Reds of Angus later enjoyed a long, respectable career of being exactly one step from the fire without falling in, until they had their own dramas, because nobody truly retires from Scottish politics in the 15th or 16th century. Someone always taps you back onto the stage.
If you want the neatest contrast for bedtime purposes, it's this. 1440 and 1452 are the same shape in a mirror. In 1440, adults used a child king to excuse a murder of guests when they believed that removing an adolescent danger would buy them peace. In 1452, an adult king used himself to excuse the murder of a guest when he believed that removing an adult danger would secure his authority. The first made the second more likely. The second made everything after it more wary. Scotland survived both. It also remembered both. We can soften out to the edges of the map now.
The Lord of the Isles watched all this, learned lessons about how far central authority would go, and chose his own moments with care. The Gordons etched bare north with a steadier hand. The Lindsays of Crawford took a breath and practiced modesty for a little while. The Kennedys, being the kind of family that produces bishops who like balance sheets, continued the dull, essential work of administration. 100 smaller households recalibrated their sense of which banner to greet first in the morning. And the king, James Fiery Face, with the stain on his cheek like a warning sign you could see across a crowded hall, set his attention on a familiar neighbor. The English still had fortified stones on the Scottish side of the line, Roxborough. He had guns now, and he had a sense of how to make stone listen to iron. He had a queen who could move money where it needed to be. He had a council that, however prickly, understood that the era of one-family states was over. The monarchy he built in the 1450s wasn't absolutist in the way later centuries would brag about, but it was coherent in a way Scotland desperately needed.
We'll end Part 3 by stepping down from the battlements to the people who had to live with the paperwork. In towns, market days grew less exciting. That's a compliment. In the borders, a spring without musters became a blessing. In parish churches, priests prayed for the souls of named Douglases without specifying colors. That's diplomacy. In manor kitchens, stewards started writing inventories as if inventories mattered. They did. In castles, hosts placed their hands on the Bible a little more obviously when receiving guests. Words mean more when you've seen them broken. Two last soft portraits before we close our eyes. In Stirling, a king walks through a hall that has memory in it, and he does not flinch. He nods at servants who have served him since he was too small to reach a salt cellar. He speaks to his queen about provisions for a summer campaign, and he smiles when the numbers add up. He trusts the bishop with the statutes because the bishop counts better than anyone else. He goes to the tilt yard and watches men who will do what he asks. He enjoys the sound of an army breathing like one thing, not 50 households next to each other. In England, an exiled earl stands under a gray sky and teaches himself to live with a smaller weather. We'll pick up next time with the last arc of James II, the guns he loved, the siege he wanted, the accident nobody could have scripted, though it felt like the century insisting on a punchline. We'll keep it gentle, of course. For now, let the corridors be empty and the doors be latched. Let the rock fade back to silhouette. You did enough listening for one night.
Hey there. Lights low, blanket situation optimal. We're moving softly into the last years of James II, the artillery years, and the slow drift from a boy who watched adults ruin a room to a king who learned to hold rooms together, mostly. We'll go easy. It's a quiet walk along the border with a few loud objects we will keep at a respectful distance. Where did we leave the map? The Black Douglases were undone. The Arkinholm moment in 1455 folded their banner up and put it on a high shelf. Parliament did its neat handwriting thing, attainders, forfeitures, redistributions. The Red Douglases of Angus smiled with great discretion and pocketed rewards. The Gordons in the north got tidier. The crown, or more precisely, a crown worn by a man who finally fit it, stopped being a suggestion and became an institution again. Under the hood, the mechanics of rule hardened in useful ways. Sheriffs acted like sheriffs rather than local enthusiasts. The exchequer stopped leaking as if it had feelings. Law courts became the place you actually went instead of the place you threatened to go. Bishop Kennedy, with his careful mind and moral accountant soul, stacked statutes like kindling and found a king willing to light them without burning the house down. And then there were the guns. James was a artillery person the way some people are horse people. He knew it. Everyone knew it. He had seen what iron could do to stone at Arbroath and elsewhere.
He had watched continental fashions in siegecraft, partly courtesy of Mary of Gelders's Burgundian connections. He bought big pieces. He commissioned bigger ones. He loved them the way a man loves a tool that promises less negotiation and more obedience. You can see the appeal if your childhood included being used as a prop in a legal skit with a terrible ending.
A slow irony. The king who learned his caution at a dinner table found comfort in machines that couldn't pretend to be anything else. A bombard is a bombard. It does not smile across a rim of wine. It does not suggest a compromise and then swallow you whole. It just throws weight at walls until the walls remember that gravity wins. By the late 1450s, the domestic picture had calmed enough for James to look up from the ledger to the horizon. The English still kept their stones on Scotland's side of the line. Not purely English, if you want to be pedantic, but English held. Roxburgh Castle and Wark Castle, planted like iron teeth along the border. Those garrisons were reminders of earlier bargains and earlier failures, and they weren't subtle. If you're a king who enjoys artillery and long-term problems, you start seeing a to-do list. Add to this the neighboring chaos of the Wars of the Roses. England was made of wet parchment at the time, tearing along old creases, one house arguing with itself. Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou on one side, the Yorkists on the other, battles with names that sound like chess moves. For a northern king with new guns and an appetite for resume tidying, the moment was workable. Your neighbors distracted. Your border fortresses are technically someone else's. You choose a side not because you like their colors, but because they offer something you want. The 15th century, where alliances are essentially swap meets. James and Mary sided with the Lancastrians, not out of sentiment, no one in the room was sentimental about these things, but because the Lancastrian royal pair had tangible favors to grant, and Scotland had a tangible request to make. Berwick upon Tweed loomed at the mouth of the Tweed like a problem statement with walls. The deal would ripen a little later. First came Roxburgh. We'll stroll to 1460 now. Late summer, the siege of Roxburgh. The king in the field looks like the version of himself he always wanted to be. Organized, supplied, confident, artillery well-sighted, messengers moving in straight lines, the feeling of a machine humming the way it should. The castle on its knoll tries to pretend this is normal. It isn't. The bombards set the tone.
A note for the myth shelf. You will hear Mons Meg connected to James II's death. It's a great name, a beloved gun still sitting at Edinburgh like a very heavy grandfather. It did not explode at Roxburgh. That's later legend, attached by people who enjoy a tidy headline. The gun that burst is often given the nickname the Lion by modern storytellers. Contemporary sources are imprecise, because when kings die unexpectedly, record-keeping takes a breath. What matters is the simple outline. A big piece burst. Metal does that sometimes, when you push heat and stress through it for long enough. The day itself had ordinary in it until it didn't. The king walked near the batteries because, of course he did. He was proud of them. He enjoyed the engineering. He liked the smell of powdered authority. He stood close enough to see angles and corrections, and then the barrel failed. Iron peeled. Fragments flew with that casual fatalism only physics can manage. The king was struck and killed. No drama, no speech, no last decree. Just a man in his prime who had finally shaped a stable realm and a cannon that didn't care. We keep it gentle here. No details need reenacting. The shock was enough. The army froze in that particular kind of silence that has logistics in it. Then something unusual happened, and it tells you a lot about Mary of Guelders. The queen, at or near the host with her council, did not dissolve into theatrical grief. She moved forward. The siege continued. Roxburgh was taken within days. The castle's walls were slighted, made unusable so it would not complicate anyone else's life again. It was the kind of steady decisiveness that doesn't make ballads, but does make maps. Mary then did the necessary sacred and practical things. The king's body went home. James III, Little James, was proclaimed. Mary assumed the regency because someone had to.
and she was best placed. And because this is the story of a long echo from a dinner, we should notice that the regent who steps forward in 1460 is a person shaped by Burgundian culture, an eye for cash flow, and zero appetite for performative cruelty. She doesn't rewrite the past. She builds a bridge over it so people can keep walking.
The political weather in 1460-1461 is windy even by Scottish standards. The Wars of the Roses intensify. Towton in March 1461 sweeps the chessboard. Edward, Duke of York, becomes Edward IV. Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou seek colder northern air. They find it. Scotland, under Mary's regency and Kennedy's counsel, offers them quarters and an understanding that favors have price tags. The price tag in this case, Berwick. This is the moment when the line on the map wiggles. Berwick upon Tweed, much fought over, much taxed, permanently tired, passes into Scottish hands in 1461. Whether you call it a gift, an exchange, or a payment depends on your appetite for euphemism. Margaret of Anjou needed shelter and support. Mary of Guelders needed a strategic harbor town to anchor the eastern border and a demonstration that Scotland wasn't simply watching history, but editing it. The arrangement made sense to both queens. The town didn't care. Towns rarely do. They just endure being traded like chess pieces by people with good cloaks. Mary's regency is one of those episodes that gets less attention than it deserves because it doesn't yell. She managed factions, Livingston remnants, Crichton lingerers, new men riding their luck, without turning council chambers into obstacle courses. She respected Kennedy's habit of making morality sound like budgeting. She kept the artillery park maintained because her late husband had a point. She began building and endowing in a very Mary way. Trinity College Church in Edinburgh, her foundation, was piety, part memory, part message. Permanence lives in stone and music, not just in who sits in which chair. She also set masonry in motion on a different kind of statement piece. Ravenscrag Castle in Fife. It's one of the first purpose-built artillery fortifications in Scotland, designed to cope with guns by shaping itself awkwardly for projectiles like a hedgehog that went to architecture school. That's Mary thinking forward. Castles too needed to learn from what killed kings. What about the Black Douglases after Arkinholm and after James' death? They didn't suddenly get invited back to Christmas. The Ninth Earl stayed in England and behaved like exiled magnates behave, alternating between letters and raids, attaching himself to whichever English faction seemed most likely to disrupt Scotland enough to let him back in. He aligned with Yorkists at points, because their enemies' enemies were his not friends. He fought a few forgettable skirmishes and stayed fundamentally irrelevant inside Scotland. The problem with building a power base on personal loyalty is that once the person is out of reach and the base is out of land, people discover new loyalties at speed.
Domestically, Mary had fewer romantic illusions about the old names than some of her male predecessors. She was pragmatic, which is a polite way of saying she rewarded people who made her day easier. The Red Douglases enjoyed continued favor when they kept their ambitions within the chalk lines. The Gordons gained in their north. The Crown's hands reached farther without shaking. It wasn't tyranny, it was competence. The country noticed the difference in small ways. Fewer special arrangements on toll roads, more sheriffs who answered their letters, a sense that if you brought a grievance to the right door, you might get a measured answer instead of a shrug. There's a gentle irony that won't keep anyone awake, but it's worth noticing. The Black Dinner of 1440 had wounded the law of hospitality so badly it staggered. The King's repeat performance at Stirling in 1452 had kicked it while it was down. Under Mary and Kennedy, you start to see the old rule stitched back together with extra thread. Safe conducts got heavier wax. Oaths were made a bit more performative. Hosts leaned into ceremony like it was a life raft. Not because anyone had suddenly become saints, but because governing is impossible if every cup might be murder. People prefer predictability over theater. Mary provided the former so thoroughly that the latter had to go find other venues. In foreign policy, the Regency kept surfing the English storm with a steady balance. The Lancastrians were useful until they weren't. Edward IV's star rose. Scottish raids in Northumberland happened because tradition is a habit no one could really break. Treaties were signed with tones of intense sincerity and very short half-lives, because that was the age. Through it all, Berwick remained a Scottish possession, a kind of practical trophy that made the border feel toe-nailed to the map for once. We can soften to the personal for a minute. Mary of Guelders didn't get a long life. She died in 1663, about 3 years after Roxburgh and 2 years after Berwick changed colors. It's too neat to say she died of the administrative strain. People died of simpler things. But the regency she left behind had a different tone because of those 3 years. James III, still a child, would grow into one of those complicated kings whose hobbies didn't match his nobles' expectations. The foundation Mary and Kennedy laid couldn't decide his personality. It did define the system around him well enough that his personality didn't immediately set the country on fire.
We can gently remind ourselves what our through line is here. The black dinner was supposed to solve a problem, a family too big for comfort. It taught everyone the wrong lesson. It made it seem acceptable to reach for public treachery as a policy tool when you'd run out of patience. 12 years later, the king repeated it at Stirling, convinced that this time, with cleaner authority and better reasons, the outcome would be tidy. It was effective, it was not clean. The decades that followed, Mary's competence, Kennedy's statutes, James II's artillery after 1455, the fall of Roxburgh, the acquisition of Berwick, were how a country learned to build a government strong enough that dinners weren't necessary to solve issues. That's not a glamorous moral. It's the right one. Since we're being fair to details, a few soft clarifications. James II died at Roxburgh in August 1460 when a bombard burst. Not Mons Meg. She's famous, she's photogenic. She did not do this particular murder. Roxburgh was taken anyway, slighted afterwards so it couldn't be used against Scotland again. Warwick tried to be a problem and succeeded for a while by simply continuing to exist. Berwick came to Scotland in 1461 courtesy of Lancastrian desperation and Scottish opportunism disguised as alliance. It would go back to England in 1482 under Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Borders are patient and vindictive. The Black Douglas's last meaningful gasp inside Scotland ended at Arkinholm in 1455. After that, their story is a low hum in the background of someone else's play. Mary of Guelders founded Trinity College Church in Edinburgh and invested in Ravenscraig's curious geometry, both the kind of quiet legacies that outlast campaign diaries.
What about the boy who became the king who liked guns? We end him in a field in the middle of something he loved, undone by the thing that had made him feel most in control. That's very medieval. It's also very human. The same tool that gives you leverage also gives you risks. He had spent years choosing machines over men because machines obey better. The universe reminded him that iron isn't that different from flesh when it decides to fail. If that sounds somber, let it be somber for a breath, and then exhale. The country he left behind was not broken by his sudden exit. That's the test of whether governing is about one person or about a system. Mary walked forward. The council didn't panic. The siege finished. The border changed. The church got a new roof somewhere. The sheriff wrote a letter and expected an answer and got one. That, for a 15th century kingdom, is an excellent epitaph. We'll leave part 4 with 3 small scenes, because bedtime likes small things. On the Tweed, fishermen work under a town that has changed flags again. They shrug in that historical way and count their catch. The taxman will be different. The river won't. In Edinburgh, workmen set stones at Trinity for Mary's foundation. They argue about whether this arch needs another inch. The master mason pretends not to care and cares very much. People pass and tug caps. A queen's piety looks like payroll to a stone layer. In a border tower that used to look to Douglas before it started looking to the crown, a steward opens a chest and finds exactly the right number of tallies. He smiles. It's a very small smile. That, for a 15th century kingdom, is an excellent epitaph.
Next time, if you're still with me, we'll drift into the early reign of James III, the son who inherited a stabilized machine and then tried to make it play music it wasn't built for. The ghost of the Black Dinner fades by then, but its lesson is still under the floorboards. Break the rules that make trust possible, and you spend decades rebuilding them. For tonight, let the guns fall quiet. Let the rock return to shadow, and let the ink on the charters dry in peace.
Hey again. Blanket, pillow, breath. We're opening the next slow page. The cannons go silent. The charters come back out, and a child begins to grow into another crown. James II is gone at Roxborough. He leaves behind a wife who knows where the Ledgers live, and a little boy who knows mostly that people whisper when he walks in. Mary of Gelders steps forward. Bishop Kennedy is still there, tidy and patient. The machine keeps humming because someone oils it every morning. That's what a functioning government looks like in this century. Not glorious, gloriously boring. Mary's regency feels like a long exhale after a sprint. She keeps peace where she can, buys time where she can't, and asks the church to help keep the roof on. Berwick is briefly Scottish, which is something you announce on banners and also on customs ledgers. Orkney and Shetland drift into the picture because of a marriage that is still a negotiation and also a map correction. Let's float north for a minute. The Danish court has a princess, Margaret. Scotland has a king who will need a wife and a dowry that pays invoices on time. King Crichton I of Denmark and Norway makes a pledge the way men do when they need to sweeten a deal. He uses what he has. He pledges the islands of Orkney and Shetland as security for the marriage portion. Security, as in we'll redeem them later. Later never comes. The islands stay. They become Scottish in the slow, everyday way. By law, by church, by grandmother's stories. It's one of the strangest, sleepiest land transfers in Europe. No battles, just paperwork. Very on brand for Mary. She dies in 1463. Too soon. The regency slides to a council, with Bishop Kennedy as the moral grown-up until 1465. He dies too, which opens the doors to louder people. Power, like water, finds new channels the second you stop stacking sandbags.
The Boyds arrive, efficient, ambitious, and right on time. In 1466, they do the move that ambitious families do in minority reigns when subtlety becomes unfashionable. They take the king's person. Abducted is the word chroniclers enjoy. It sounds dramatic. It was mostly practical. A teenage James III is walked out of one controlled space and into another. Suddenly, policy wears Boyd colors. Lord Boyd becomes Great Chamberlain. His son Thomas is created Earl of Arran, because why not double down? They even marry Thomas to the king's sister, Princess Mary. Useful to have the royal family at both ends of your dinner table. It all looks very neat for a year or two. To their credit, the Boyds also helped move the marriage with Denmark from idea to Isle. In 1469, Margaret of Denmark arrives. She's sensible, with a spine that doesn't creak. Holyrood smells like new cloth and new politics. The dowry paperwork is real. Orkney and Shetland shift fully into Scottish hands, not as a trophy but as collateral that no one ever calls in. If you're fond of tidy facts, those islands will stay where they landed, pledged, unredeemed, absorbed. And then the trap door. While Thomas Boyd is off being useful, escorting the new queen back, his family's enemies finish a little list, charges of treason. Parliament does what Parliament does. It looks solemn and applies words to facts in ways that alter careers. Lord Boyd flees. Thomas is attainted in absentia. His marriage to the princess is annulled. She marries again to James Hamilton of Cadzow. The Hamiltons will remember this moment when they start tracing how they got near the front in later centuries. That's how upward mobility looks in silk. So, James III. Young, married, enthroned, and, as it turns out, not built like his father. He prefers harmony to drums. He likes goldsmiths more than generals. He collects artists and architects, not winter campaigns. He is the kind of man who will peer at a carving and make a note about the line of a sleeve. Chroniclers, who usually write for families with banners, are not charmed. They call his interests low. They mean not useful to them. James prefers men who can make things to men who can break things. It sounds modern. It wasn't. It was infuriating to his nobles.
We'll keep it calm and honest. He is not a bad king. He is a king at an angle to the people who expect a specific silhouette. He mints better coins. The gold unicorn appears on his watch, a fantastical animal on very real money, which is a perfect joke if you like jokes about budgets. He fosters chapels. He dabbles in what his critics call astrology and alchemy, which is to say he pays people who claim to understand how the world works. He appreciates music that isn't marching. He repairs and improves. He throws favors to craftsmen who know how to turn stone into something that will still be admired when the people who paid for it are dust. But there's always a but. He is also suspicious, especially of men near him who have claims of their own. His brothers are problems before they become tragedies. John, Earl of Mar, is spoken of as charming and bright. In 1479, he is arrested on dark, vague charges, sorcery, and the kind of accusations people whisper when they need to turn love into fear. He dies in custody. Some later writers will have him bled in a bath. It's probably a tale. It reads like a tale, but the mood is right. A death in a quiet room with shutters closed, a king who signed off on it or couldn't stop it. Either way, a stain you can't launder. The other brother, Alexander, Duke of Albany, refuses to play the obedient spare. He is the kind of man who looks at a map and sees a mirror. He leaves, returns, deals, leaves again. In 1482, he signs up with Edward IV of England in a document that basically makes him backup king if the main one would kindly stop. The Treaty of Fotheringhay. It promises too much on all sides, like most treaties drafted by ambitious men with good pens. And then 1482 happens. It is the year the nobles decide that taste in friends is treason. James has surrounded himself with favorites who smell of buildings and velvet rather than border mud. One name the storytellers never tire of is Cochrane, a Mason architect turned courtman. Whether he was as powerful as later chroniclers say is debatable. Whether he was tolerated by men with swords is not. He wasn't. At Lauder Bridge, south of Edinburgh, the great lords take the king into care. It's the 1466 move with better boots.
They hang the favorites on the spot, over the bridge side if you want the picturesque version. Cochrane among them, according to tradition. The nobles keep the king, very politely, while they tidy his household. It's not a revolution. It's a reset, with rope. Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus, nicknamed Bell the Cat because he once volunteered to do the dangerous thing while everyone else was narrating, features loudly. It's efficient. It also advertises a problem you can't fix with more executions. The king and his old nobility want different things from a crown. At the same moment, England, efficient as ever at multitasking, takes Berwick back. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, leads the operation. He will later be Richard III with a reputation problem and a skeleton in a car park. For now, he's a competent general with a spare army, and he uses it. Berwick is gone from Scotland for good in 1482. The border shifts, just slightly, in England's favor. That line will harden. Albany tries to ride this storm into a throne. He fails elegantly. He reconciles briefly. He fails again. He dies in France a few years later, a tournament casualty if you like your noble exits poetic. James II had died by iron. Albany dies by sport. The century leans into its themes. James III survives Lauder. He even regains day-to-day control. He withdraws into places that smell like polish. Stirling becomes more home than war camp. He works on chapels, cures his eyes on gardens, gives more to music. He makes sure coins look right. He creates new titles with the light hand of a man who believes honor can become policy. He elevates sons, creates roles, and hopes the structure will love him back. It doesn't. His queen, Margaret of Denmark, is steady. They have sons, James, the heir, another James, and John. The heirs' names confuse scribes and bedtime listeners alike. The marriage is not a romance, the way poets would script it, but it functions. Margaret even mediates when her husband's nobles look like storm clouds. She dies in 1486. One more stabilizer gone. The next 2 years are exactly as calm as you'd expect.
The dissolution of trust is not dramatic. It's millimeter by millimeter. A lord denied something he believes is old. A sheriff replaced with a man who plays the lute. A brother dead with rumors attached. A coin with a unicorn that looks smug if your rent is late. A court that feels like a workshop rather than a war room. None of these are crimes. Together, they become a story people tell about why the realm feels wrong. By early 1488, the barons form what amounts to a support group with banners. They gather for the good of the realm, which is the medieval way of saying, we would like different management. They put the 15-year-old Prince James at the front of the parade as a living manifesto. It's the old trick. If your revolt needs a halo, borrow one from a child. The prince is not the author of the manifesto. He is the book cover. The king tries to make arrangements. He calls loyalists. There are still many. Huntley in the north, Athol, some Douglases of the Red persuasion, people who prefer kings who stay in one piece. He moves towards Stirling. The rebel hosts move the same way. No sudden charges, no drums in your ear here. Just two armies whose commanders all went to the same funerals and can guess each other's breakfast. June 11th, 1488. Sauchiburn, a few miles from Stirling, which will forever be the stage for family arguments in armor. The fight is brief and confused. It's not Bannockburn with speeches and manuscripts. It's not Lauder with a flourish. It's a morning with bad visibility and worse assumptions. The king's line breaks. He rides. He falls. He reaches a mill. A story says an unknown man offers him help or confession. Another says the unknown man makes sure there is no more need for help or confession. Either way, James III dies away from the noise. We'll keep it soft. No blood, just the shape. A man who wanted music and masonry dies in the kind of quiet room he preferred. The realm shrugs into its next coat.
The boy becomes James IV. He will wear a chain around his waist, under his clothes, as penance, people say. Iron against skin. Every Lent, another link, another reminder. Whether the chain was daily or seasonal, visible or imagined, the point is this. The son understood the weight of being used as a standard around which men killed his father. He grows into a king who tries to be everything his father wasn't. Open, visible, charming. Dangerous. That's for another night. What do we make of the arc we just padded through? The Black Dinner wasn't a lone wildfire. It was tinder. It taught the people in charge that rules meant less than necessities dressed up as law. In 1452, an adult king learned that lesson too well. In 1482, his son's nobles learned a related one. If you don't like a king's friends, you don't need Parliament to fix it if there's a bridge. In 1488, another son learned that if you put a prince in front of your grievances, you might win the day and lose the century. There are gentler notes worth holding. Orkney and Shetland came to Scotland not by sword, but by signature. They stayed because life works that way. People built churches. Coins changed hands. A new recipe was learned for a winter stew. Life outlived policy. Mary of Gelders gave the realm 3 steady years that mattered more than speeches. Bishop Kennedy taught a country to prefer statutes over stunts. Those are the kinds of things that make you sleep better in the long run than good calorie. We can set down a few small portraits before we close our eyes. In Kirkwall, a woman lights a candle in a cathedral that wouldn't be Scottish if a dowry had been paid promptly. She doesn't know that. She knows the light helps her remember a name. On the 4th, a boat slides under Stirling Bridge, and a man in the boat looks up at the castle and can't remember which James built what. It doesn't matter. The walls are still there. In a town off the Tweed, a gold coin with a unicorn sits in the palm of a baker who prefers bread to symbolism. He bites it. It tastes like metal. If you want a moral, it's the same one we've been landing on in low light since part 1.
The rules that make people feel safe are boring until they break. Break them enough, and you don't get clever solutions. You get long decades of careful stitching. Mary stitched. Kennedy stitched. James II, in his way, tried to hammer the cloth flat. James III embroidered, while others wanted canvas. The fabric held. Barely. Then it was someone else's turn with the needle. Next time, if you want to keep floating, we can drift with James IV, the bright one who danced, prayed, calculated, and walked into a field at Flodden with everything and lost it. But that's loud history, and we do quiet here. For now, let the damp border wind smooth itself out. Let the rooms grow empty. Let the stone remember music again. You've done enough listening.
Hey again, lights low, shoulders down, we're floating into a reign that people like to call Scotland's Renaissance, which is generous and not wrong. The court got clever. The king wore a chain under his shirt. There were ships the size of small neighborhoods. There were also experiments you probably wouldn't approve in a modern ethics review. We'll treat them gently. James IV arrives with a story already attached to him. The chain first. After Saki-burn and the death of his father, the new king is said to have worn an iron belt beneath his clothes. Penance. Some say he added links each year, some say he wore it only during Lent. Either way, the image captures what mattered. He carried a reminder that kingship, for him, began with a very personal wrong. It didn't make him timid, it made him purposeful. He traveled. A lot. Kings who stay put learn one story. Kings who ride learn several. James took justice on the road in the old way. Airs and circuits, where sheriffs and judges set up under a painted canopy and made the law look like a thing you could see. It sounds dull. It's how you rebuild after decades of performative politics. People prefer paper trails to rumors once they've tried both. He also inherited a lingering problem we met earlier, semi-independent territories acting like they had their own scripts. The lordship of the Isles, that old West Coast's nearly kingdom, had been sliding toward dissolution for years. In 1493, the lordship was finally forfeited to the crown. You don't absorb a sea state with a sentence, but James set about actually integrating the West. Forts were minded, admiralties tidied. The message was careful but clear. There would be one realm, not several under one name. He liked the trappings of a bright court and the substance behind them. He boosted universities. He backed printing. Edinburgh's first press was working by 1508 because having laws people could read was more reliable than trusting heralds to shout them correctly in rain. He funded music and kept a chapel royal where the choir could do the heavenly work that makes hearts lift in stone rooms. He patronized poets who had lines and opinions. William Dunbar folded compliments into knives and presented them with a bow. It was a vibe.
James also liked the practical sciences, by which the 15th century meant things that might fix a person or make a substance into a better substance. He paid surgeons and barbers. The treasurer's accounts have quiet entries for poultices, for the king's instruments, and for gratitude payments when he assisted with procedures. There's a note about a woman's tooth being pulled by the king himself, which is either charming, alarming, or both. He did bloodletting on patients, standard therapy then, though modern medicine would suggest alternatives. He also funded an alchemist, John Damian, who promised the usual, the philosopher's stone, universal medicine, a good return on investment. Damian even tried to fly off the walls of Stirling Castle with wings made of feathers, which is the kind of demonstration that tells you everything about a court's appetite for ideas and a physician's appetite for risk. He survived with a broken thigh and an explanation about how chicken feathers were the problem. Of course they were. The king's curiosity sometimes wandered into areas that today would prompt a form to be filled out in triplicate. Chroniclers claim he arranged a language experiment on Inchkeith, 2 infants raised by a silent nurse to hear what language they would naturally speak. A legend, probably. But people repeat it because it fits the character.
a king who wanted to know how things work, who thought you could test your way into answers. If he'd had laboratories, you suspect he would have labeled drawers. What he had were islands and monks and time. Before the long, strong peace with England, there was one last chapter of theatrical politics. Enter Perkin Warbeck, the pretender who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes supposedly lost in the Tower of London. Warbeck arrived in 1495 with a story polished enough to catch the light briefly. James saw possibilities, not necessarily because he believed Warbeck, but because a plausible claimant is a lever. He hosted Perkin, treated him as a prince, and even married him to Lady Catherine Gordon, a young woman of high birth and better manners. That was both kindness and politics. If you're going to use someone's presence, house him properly. There were excursions south, a raid in 1496 that felt more like choreography than conquest. The point wasn't to grab towns, the point was to make England look both ways. Henry VIII was steady and unsentimental, which meant everyone eventually realized a different approach would be cheaper. In 1497 came the Treaty of Eighton, the first solid peace between Scotland and England since the 13th century. It set out practicalities, it framed borders, it stuck because it was paperwork that made sense to both sides, and because both kings had other things to do.
Then the marriage that made ballad writers happy. In 1503, James IV married Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's daughter. The match came with a deliberate title for the peace, the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, because why not speak kindly to the future? Edinburgh put on its best surfaces. The formal entry of the Queen featured pageants that made allegories out of virtues, because that's how you told a city's children something nice while blocking traffic. He was 30. She was in her early teens, which was distressingly normal for dynastic arrangements. They did their duty to diplomacy, and increasingly to each other. The poet Dunbar wrote The Thistle and the Rose so sweetly, you might almost forget that the last two generations had favored axes as an argument. The peace was real, but not absolute. Raiding didn't stop because treaties existed. It slowed when sheriffs could supervise partial grown-ups. James navigated border law with more care than his predecessors. He signed, he enforced, he gave safe conducts with weight, because he knew the cost of broken ones. It was a quiet repair of that old torn cloth we started with. Hospitality is something you could trust again. Ambassadors crossed the Tweed without reaching for their rosaries every mile. That's progress. At the same time, James was very much a man with a private life that produced private consequences. Before his marriage, he'd had relationships that produced children. He acknowledged several and provided for them in the ordinary aristocratic way. Lands, training, marriages planned so they could be useful without destabilizing the realm. After the marriage, he continued to have favorites. Janet Kennedy is the name people remember. Beautiful, well-placed, politically entangled. There's also Margaret Drummond, who died in 1501 along with her two sisters after eating at Drummond Castle. Poison was whispered. It usually is when three aristocratic women die on the same day. Some said it was a plot to clear the way for the Tudor marriage. Convenient stories are always very convenient. No proof, just the kind of rumor that sticks because it flatters our sense that politics can reach into kitchens. The king made pious donations for Margaret's soul. He married Margaret Tudor anyway because kingship doesn't offer a third option when Europe is looking. He built because kings in this era announce themselves in stone and timber. Stirling's Chapel Royal, with its painted ceiling and delicate light, is part of his feeling for music housed in wood. Linlithgow got facades that make you exhale. He had an eye for detail, a fondness for carved flowers that looked like they were freshly made. He spent on ships, too, because nothing says state with plans like a navy. In 1511, the Great Michael launched at New Haven.
It was enormous by the standards of the day, a floating credenza with guns. People said it took all the woods of Fife. That's a brag and an exaggeration, but the point landed. Scotland had a flagship that made visitors feel very provincial.
The court he built felt finished. Musicians had salaries. Alchemists had benches. Poets had deadlines. Architects had opinions. Priests had choral schedules. Clerks wrote down how much candles cost, because daylight is a plan, not an assumption. It is pleasantly domestic for a while. The penance chain, if he wore it then, lay against a chest that had breathed easier. Even kings like to know what the next Tuesday will look like. And then Europe did the thing Europe does. It rearranged itself. Henry VIII died in 1509 and left his throne to a young man with heroic energy and a habit of spending it. Henry VIII liked tournaments and campaigns. France and England resumed their ancient habit of bothering each other with everyone else's supporting cast. The Auld Alliance between Scotland and France was a real commitment. When one was attacked, the other was expected to move. Henry VIII went to war in France in 1513. France called. James had to decide whether perpetual peace with England could outvote a treaty older than most cathedrals. He chose the alliance. You can argue motives all night. Honor, obligation, calculation, annoyance at border garrisons building new works on old sites. His letters include all of it. He warned Catherine of Aragon, Henry's queen and acting regent while her husband was in France, that he would cross if provoked. She answered like a person who had read contracts and watched men break them. War happened anyway. It's 1513. Summer turning to autumn. James marches south. We will treat Flodden softly. The battlefield sits on a hill with long grass. The weather does what northern weather does when it's asked to be meaningful. The Scottish army crossed the border with modern artillery and pikes, drilled into something like a new shape by European captains. The English host, under the Earl of Surrey, came north in a quieter key, with the habit of fighting on home ground. The two met on 9 September 1513 on slopes that looked gentler than they fought.
No color, no clang, just the outline we can live with. The Scottish line lost its footing and its breath. The English billmen did their slow, ugly work in the kind of fight nobody writes pretty songs about. James IV died there, with a large number of his nobles. Identifications came after, with rumors and reliquaries. Catherine of Aragon sent Henry a piece of a banner and a letter that reads like a woman who understands theater and sorrow in equal parts. Scotland went home smaller, suddenly, with a king gone and an infant heir. People later called the men who fell the flowers of the forest, because grief likes a metaphor that feels like wind in trees. If you want the echo of the Black Dinner here, it's not in violence, it's in the aftermath. In 1440, the breach in hospitality tore the fabric. It took decades to stitch it back. James IV had spent his reign building habits that made trust possible: safe conducts, thoughtful law, honest welcomes for guests and ambassadors. Flodden didn't undo those. It did something else. It stripped away the person who'd made the system feel warm and left the system to look after itself. The test of a reign is not how it glitters. It's what happens when it stops. What happened immediately was competence. Margaret Tudor, now Queen Dowager, took the regency for her son, James V, because the Lords had no better short-term plan, and because shaky peace with England looked shakiest if the regent was the English king's sister. She had that Tudor knack for surviving rooms that don't particularly want you in them. For a while it worked. Then the usual pressures intruded. Factions required oxygen. The French-born Duke of Albany arrived later as governor, but those are other nights. The long consequence we should hold gently is quieter. The 1503 marriage, the thistle and the rose,
put a Tudor in Scotland's nursery and a Stuart in England's crosshairs in a way no one entirely understood. A century later, the crown of England would pass to James VI of Scotland, great-grandson of James IV and Margaret Tudor, because Henry VIII's dynastic math ran out of local options. That union of crowns in 1603, whatever you think of what followed, grew from a marriage signed in a court that had learned, the hard way, to prefer paper to dinners with interludes.
A few soft scenes from James IV's private angles, because our series likes the human edges. He loved ships and made time for shipyards the way other kings toured stables. He sponsored the great Michael with something like affection. He gave money to mariners who knitted his realm together along coasts more reliable than inland roads. It wasn't romance. It was infrastructure with sails. He had a thing for craftsmanship. He paid goldsmiths to chase delicate designs in silver, then actually noticed them. He spent on masons and looked at their work with an eye trained enough to be annoying. He didn't just pass through his rooms. He saw them. He kept holy days in ways both public and personal. The chain, if we can trust tradition, wasn't a performance for the gallery. He didn't show it, he carried it. He gave generously to friaries that taught as well as prayed. He liked the observance, a stricter Franciscan branch, for their seriousness, which says something about his appetite for sincerity under the ornament. He made time for his illegitimate children and arranged their futures. Not unusual, but a mark of a man who understood that responsibility isn't divisible by ceremony. Children who happen outside a marriage still need roofs, tutors, and tenderness. The accounts say he provided them.
We can finish part 6 by circling our theme. Hospitality and trust are the boring threads that keep a political fabric from fraying. The black dinner cut through both, crisply. It taught the next generation the wrong lesson. The following kings had to spend decades learning the right one. James II tried to enforce order with dinners and cannons. James III tried to replace feuds with frescoes, and the nobility refused to be redecorated. James IV, with chain and pen, did the hard work. He made welcome work again. He signed. He visited. He lived as if relationships could be reliable. His ending was sudden and hard. His legacy, though, was the quieter thing he left behind, a habit of governance that outlasted a person. It's no small gift. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. The ships in Leith rock gently against their moorings. Stirling's chapel keeps its painted angels, even in the dark. In a house near the Royal Mews, a barber counts his instruments and is glad they're put away for the night. On Inchkeith, the wind says nothing in any language, which is how most wind prefers it. Next time, if you want to keep drifting, we can follow the long after of Flodden, the regencies, the little James V who learned too many adult lessons too early, and the way this century kept trying to turn tragedies into systems and systems into something livable. No rush. History isn't going anywhere. For tonight, let the chain rest, let the sea quiet, and let the paper in the royal coffers stop rustling.
Hey again, settle in. We're picking up the thread with a very small crown and a very long to-do list. The cannons have gone quiet, the paper comes back out. Scotland moves from a king who liked engines to a boy who wore pennants. Flodden is behind us. James IV is gone. Margaret Tudor, his widow, Henry VIII's daughter, steps into the space called Regency, because someone has to, and she knows where the keys are. The council hums. Bishop Kennedy is no longer with us to play moral accountant, but his kind of thinking lingers in the room. The machine works because it has to. That's the main lesson of the century. The system must learn to survive the person. Margaret's early regency is the quiet competence kind. She doesn't try to be a soldier, she tries to be a steward. She keeps sheriffs busy, she negotiates with England carefully, as you would if the person across the border is your brother-in-law's son. She also lines up a deal that seems boring until you look at a modern map, the Orkney and Shetland transaction. The Danish king, Crichton I, pledged those islands as security for his daughter's dowry when Margaret and James III had matched their children on paper. Payment never makes it to the counter in full. Security becomes permanence. The islands slide gently into the Scottish legal orbit without a single siege tower. No trumpets, just parchment. A crown that likes artillery learns to love collateral. But then the 1460s again? Not quite. This time the tug-of-war is louder. The Duke of Albany, John Stuart, arrives as governor from France because send an adult cousin is Europe's minority cheat code. He brings French polish and steady hands and a clear sense that his job is to keep the crown intact while the child grows into it. Meanwhile, Margaret, young, royal, and understandably tired of being everyone's weather vane, remarries in 1514. She chooses Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, because why not marry a Douglas again? It's the century's favorite brand. The marriage is romantic enough for a paragraph and inconvenient enough for a chapter. The terms of her regency explicitly say that if she remarries, she loses it. She remarries, she loses it.
The custody of James, the little king, becomes the game piece everyone wants to hold and no one wants to share. Margaret flees at one point, pregnant and practical, slipping south to England for safety while Albany manages the government and the infant Alexander, Duke of Ross, is born and then dies in infancy. The air fills with letters dressed as complaints. Everyone claims to act for the boy. The boy learns what rooms sound like when they stop talking as you enter. Albany is not a villain here. He tries to be neutral and fails only because neutrality is an offensive concept in a room full of ambitions. He returns to France, comes back, holds on, leaves again. Through it all, Angus works angles. In 1525, he gets what every overambitious stepfather dreams of: the king's person inside his household with the door closed. From 1525 to 1528, James V lives under Angus's protection, which is the polite word for, "You sit here while I sign." He's a teenager with a pen that signs the wrong charters. He learns to smile at men holding his ink. The child becomes someone else in those years. Suspicious, good at listening, good at remembering who said what and where they looked afterwards. He watches money like it's a language. He keeps his gratitude folded small and his grudges neatly pressed. He gets taller, and in the summer of 1528, at 16, he runs. The escape is one of those moments that everyone tells differently because everyone wishes they had been there. The outline is steady. He leaves his handlers, he rides fast, he ends up at Stirling Castle, that old shore rock, and declares his majority, which is to say, he tells the country he will be the one making the decisions attached to his name. The Douglases are proclaimed traitors. Angus flees to England, where exiled Scottish noblemen become decorative and useful in alternating seasons. Forfeitures follow. The Great Douglas House, yes, the same narrative we've been following since Nor dinners in 1440, finds itself on the wrong side of royal paper again. You would think everyone would learn from repetitive motifs. You would be wrong. James V begins his real reign with a tour. He goes where kings are supposed to go when they want the law to stick. Justice airs, circuits, public hearings. He presents himself as someone who will actually read complaints. He acquires a nickname people still debate the sincerity of, the King of the Commons. What it meant in practice was simpler. He showed up. He made judgments. He made a habit. In a country that had learned to fear invitations, that mattered.
He also carried with him that quiet legend, the iron chain beneath his shirt, penance for Sachiburn, where his father died while rebels waved the prince like a banner. The details of the chain vary depending on who you ask. Some say he wore it always, some say only in Lent, adding a link each year. The image is the point. He made the guilt literal. He didn't perform it, he wore it. But a penitent king is still a king with tasks. The borders are a problem. The reivers treat raids like sport. James decides to remind them of the color of the law. In 1530, he summons Johnny Armstrong of Gilnockie, a famous raider, to a meeting at Carlin Rig. The end is execution. Whether safe conduct was implied and broken is debated. What is not debated is the echo. Hospitality and the crown still have a complicated relationship in this century. Even when the policy is popular, the method carries a shadow. In religion, James plants his feet in old soil. Europe is moving. Luther has nailed and written and argued. Henry VIII down south is politely divorcing the papacy while not being polite. James V does not pivot. He remains Catholic in the thorough, comfortable way of a man who loves ceremony and finds meaning in habit. He cracks down on Protestant preachers. In 1528, Patrick Hamilton, a young noble with Lutheran ideas, is burned at St. Andrews. A later Protestant quip says, "The smoke of Master Patrick Hamilton infected as many as it blew upon." That's a line from a man with a point to make. It also captures the truth that persecution often acts like advertising. James backs the bishops anyway. He funds observant Franciscans, the stricter ones. He likes sincerity more than debate. He will not follow Henry into rebranding the church. It costs him friendships and creates a future problem. He still declines. In the private life department, he behaves like a Renaissance prince. He appreciates women, and they appreciate being appreciated. Before his marriages, he has relationships that produce children. He acknowledges several, rare honesty for the era, and provides for them. James Stuart, later Earl of Moray, is one. His mother is Margaret Erskine. He will matter very much in another chapter. There were others. Euphemia Elphinstein bears him a son who becomes Earl of Orkney. Elizabeth Beaton, another. The point isn't the count, it's the pattern. He creates a network of half-royal sons and daughters he can place where crowns find it useful to have cousins. The first official marriage is to Madeleine of Valois in 1537. She is French, delicate, well-born, and consumptive. He meets her in France with all the chivalry he can muster. He likes her. They marry. She comes to Scotland in winter air with lungs that don't know how to survive it. She dies months later, loved and mourned, and buried with a sadness that touches even people who don't like poetry. It's the kind of tragedy that cleans a court of cynicism for at least a week.
France, practical and allied, offers another bride, because alliances are made of people and calendars. Mary of Guise arrives in 1538, tall, composed, a widow with one child already, and a personality that reads as granite under velvet. Henry VIII had noticed her in the catalogue and reportedly asked for her himself. The story says she joked, "I may be a big woman, but I have a very little neck," which is the kind of line a 16th century queen says through a smile to make sure the room understands she has read the English news. She marries James and brings what French queens bring: money, manners, and a team who know what polished governance looks like. It suits him. They have children quickly. 2 sons, James, Duke of Rothesay, and Arthur or Robert, depending on the source's mood, born in 1540 and 1541. Both die in infancy within months of each other. Later, in December 1542, Mary is born. She will have a long, noisy life. For now, she is a fragile pink object in a linen bundle. Those losses in 1541 land hard. James's mother, Margaret Tudor, also dies in 1541 after 3 marriages, a robust correspondence habit, and the exhausting task of being related to people who started arguments by waking up. James folds into himself. The chain, if he still wears it, gets heavier. He is not broken, he is bruised. He leans harder into France, which is to say, into the old alliance and out of any pretense of warming to Henry VIII theological creativity. The final slide toward war with England in 1542 is tiresome in that diplomatic way. Henry demands that James meet him at York. James agrees, then doesn't show. He had reasons: church politics, caution, perhaps just a sense that attending a king who had recently deleted 2 wives was not an afternoon stroll. Henry is offended in the very Henry way. Raids begin. The border catches fire on schedule. For a moment, Scotland does well at Haddon Rig. Then November arrives, and with it, Solway Moss. Solway Moss is not a battle that sings. It wheezes. The Scottish array is large, late, and leaderful in the worst way. Commands overlap. Confidence runs ahead of cohesion. The English force under Sir Thomas Wharton is smaller, but moves like one thing. The Scots flounder, literally and organizationally, on ground that does not want to hold them. Many noblemen are taken prisoner. Others find their way home carrying shame like cold water in their boots.
James V is not at the fight. He is sick at Falkland. The news arrives the way bad news does in this century, piecemeal, polished, and worse when fully assembled. He falls into something that looks like illness and grief tied together. On December 8th, Mary of Guise gives birth to a daughter at Linlithgow. 6 days later, December 14th, 1542, James dies at Falkland Palace. The line people love to quote, "It came with a lass and it will go with a lass," is probably a later invention. If he said anything neat, it doesn't matter. The neat part is the irony. The Stuart line had begun with Marjorie Bruce, alas. It had now passed to Mary, alas. Crowns like circular jokes. Let's keep it soft. No deathbed theatrics, just a man under blankets, tired with a head full of numbers and prayers and a chain against his skin. He leaves a 6-day-old queen. He leaves a wife who knows how to fill a ledger and a cradle at once. He leaves nobles who learn very fast how to pivot from disloyal to indispensably loyal. He leaves the English with prisoners who will soon be released in exchange for promises that won't last past spring. Immediately, Scotland performs its favorite emergency ritual, regency. The heir is a baby. James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, closest heir male and a man with a plant-based surname and a flexible conscience, becomes governor. Cardinal David Beaton, the church's most determined politician, has a set of papers that say he should be governor instead, allegedly from the late king. No one can agree which papers count. Arran counts his weapons, Beaton counts his bishops. This goes as you would expect. They share the stage without sharing purpose. The baby queen sleeps through most of it. Henry VIII sees the obvious opportunity. He proposes to fix the Anglo-Scottish problem by marrying Mary to his son, Prince Edward, which is as practical as a border idea can be and as tender as a Tudor proposition gets. In 1543, at Greenwich, a treaty is signed. It looks moderate and clever. Mary will marry Edward when of age. There will be peace in the meantime. Scotland will send her south when appropriate. The ink dries, the paper sits, the room changes. The church party recoils, Arran doubts, Beaton maneuvers. The Greenwich plan unravels, in the noble way, slowly, with complaints. The English response is what people will later call the rough wooing. It's exactly what it sounds like, persuasion by fire. In 1544, the Earl of Hertford lands at Leith with instructions to make his point. Edinburgh burns, Leith burns, Holyrood is sacked. The English army leaves the kind of smoke that makes new Protestants and old enemies in equal numbers. More raids follow in 1545. Some Scottish victories happen.
Ancram Moor, for instance, a quick, clever fight that emboldens balladeers. Then 1547 mutters its way to the wide bank of the Esk at Pinkie-Cleugh. The English, under Somerset, now Protector, win with cannon and horse in a modern key. The Scottish army takes a hard hit. The baby queen becomes a hotter commodity. And then she's gone. In 1548, Mary is sent to France for safety, education, and an engagement to the Dauphin. The Auld Alliance cashes a check.
We're getting ahead of ourselves a little on purpose to show the shape of what James V left behind. He had tried to build a consistent kingdom. He had chosen France and chosen Catholicism and chosen to wear sorrow privately and governance publicly. His daughter will come back to all of that in a decade with French manners, French habits, and a very Scottish set of problems waiting like house guests who didn't leave. Mary of Guise, after years of balancing acts, will become regent in 1554 and try to make order out of a room that prefers acoustics. Before we leave James V, a few gentle portraits, because bedtime likes edges. He built palaces with a distinct tone. Falkland is a hunting lodge with French ideas in stone. Stirling's Great Hall is a clean, bright volume for ceremony. The Chapel Royal holds painted beams and layered music. The Stirling heads, those carved roundels with faces, royal and mythic, tell you everything about his taste. Detailed, amused, slightly extravagant, and interested in people's expressions. He loved hunting in the structured way kings did. Deer parks managed like quiet factories, where ritual and meat met. Hawks, hounds, autumn hare. It wasn't just sport. It was the business of being seen as the center of a natural order. He liked to fix things with his hands, not just people, objects. He had instruments mended and tried them. He handled tools. A king who can hold a scalpel or a pair of compasses is rare. It's the kind of detail that makes you forgive a ledger entry you didn't like. He was careful about money. The exchequer under him was less a sieve and more a bowl. He paid debts. He demanded dues. People always dislike that in kings, until the roads improve. Even then, they mutter. He let them mutter and paved anyway. He wore that chain, if he did, without needing you to admire it. The point of penance is not the gallery, it's the weight.
We've walked a long arc from a trencher in 1440 to a cradle in 1542. The same names keep drifting in and out of the light. Douglas, Stuart, Angus, Hamilton, like actors who won't retire. The same rules, hospitality, safe conduct, oaths, keep getting broken and mended. The same lesson repeats softly. A country can survive almost anything. If its people believe invitations are safe, money is counted fairly, and children won't be turned into arguments. Fail those, and you don't get melodrama. You get a very long mending process with needles and patience. Next time we can drift with the infant queen to France and back again. Mary raised in French sunlight, a return to Scottish weather, and a court that never quite put away its axes. The chain changes hands, the paper gets busier, the rooms get louder. We'll keep it quiet anyway. For tonight, let the Falkland rooms grow dim, let the chapel hold its last note, and let the road between Stirling and Linlithgow be just a road again.
Hey again. Soft light, slow breath. We're following a baby queen across a sea into a court that spoke a different language, wore different perfumes, and had bigger tapestries. It's a quiet sail with occasional political weather. We left Scotland in a mood. Burned towns, rattled nerves, a small child with a crown. The rough wooing did exactly what it said on the tin. English armies tried to persuade Scotland into a dynastic marriage by setting things on fire. The answer to arson was diplomacy. In 1548, the Scots made the decision every neighbor expected.
They bundled the infant Mary onto ships and sent her to France. The Aln Alliance wasn't just poetry, it was childcare. Mary went with a full supporting cast. Some you'll get to know as the Four Marys: Mary Beaton, Mary Seton, Mary Fleming, Mary Livingston, the kind of courtly best friends situation that made poems write themselves. She arrived to the Valois court, which specialized in being exquisite and exhausting at the same time. The rooms were big, the fabrics were bigger, the politics were delicately sharpened knives wrapped in compliments. The little queen adapted fast. She was tall for the era, and by her teens, fluent in the kinds of languages that made ambassadors feel heard. French, naturally, Latin to read more than marginalia, some Italian for style, enough Scots to remember where home was. She learned dance in the formal way where steps are politics and politics are steps. She learned music in rooms where a lute could be both entertainment and a way to underline a sentence you didn't want to say out loud. She learned hawking because nobles understood the world better with a bird on the wrist. She learned that smiles are tools, and eyes are signals, and documents are weather forecasts. She also learned that being a queen in another country means being a symbol in two directions at once. To the French, she was Scotland's future in satin. To the Scots, she was Scotland's future in someone else's satin. Everything she did meant something for someone. Even embroidery, which she did well. The woman could sew a point. Also, people forget this, but she played golf and went out incognito for masks because court life, even then, benefited from a little pretend. File that under Scotland's early sports history you didn't think we'd whisper about.
France did what France does with valuable alliances. It elevated them. In 1558, Mary married the Dauphin, Francis. He was kind, small, and delicate, the type of boy who looked like he had always just recovered from something. Their wedding played to the strengths of everyone involved. Mary looked lovely in beauty pageant and statehood ways. France looked generous. Scotland looked aligned with a top-tier brand. In 1559, the Dauphin became Francis II. Mary, who had been Queen of Scotland since birth, was now Queen Consort of France, too. Double crowns, double headaches. The Guises, Mary's mother's family, were in power around the new king, and their enemies felt every inch of it. That court ate politics like almonds. It didn't last. Francis died at the end of 1560, still a teenager. Mary was 18, suddenly a young widow, and once again a symbol in two directions. She stayed long enough to pack and cry in rooms where the walls could handle it. She refused to ratify the Treaty of Edinburgh, which had tried to clip her and her Guises out of certain styles of claim. She wanted to keep the English question open, not because she was greedy, but because dynastic math was in her blood, and everyone, including Elizabeth across the water, counted her in those sums. Which brings us to the fog. In 1561, Mary asked Elizabeth for safe conduct to sail home to Scotland. Elizabeth, who hated being thought about as a chess piece, wasn't thrilled about granting formal courtesies to a woman who still dreamt of her chair someday. The safe conduct wasn't forthcoming in the way Mary wanted. She sailed anyway. English ships looked ready to make a point. The weather did its classic intervention. Fog tucked her ship into Leith with a soft hand. Practical mercy, courtesy of the climate. She stepped onto a shore that had changed while she was away. The 1560 Parliament in Scotland had tilted the table. The old church was out, officially. The Protestant kirk had built itself a frame. Simple worship, simple rooms, complicated negotiations about how money and morality would be arranged. Mary was a Catholic queen with a conscience and a desire for private mass. Scotland was a newly Protestant country with a strong opinion on idolatry and a memory for fire. Welcome home. To her credit, Mary moved with tact. She kept her household mass private. She publicly supported the new official order, even while personally avoiding it. She danced and smiled and made the king's men feel like they were in a play.
She kept her dogs because queens did. She kept her needlework because queens did that too. She rode to the hunt and made it look good. She did paperwork. She learned everyone's worst rumor and didn't repeat it. She had that courtly gift for making you think you were being agreed with while she actually said nothing. It's a skill.
Enter John Knox, all angles and thunder. He'd written the first blast of the trumpets against the monstrous regiment of women in 1558 to make an argument about female rulers he wouldn't have gotten away with saying in person. Mary and Knox had personal interviews where he told her she was wrong in a great many ways. She listened, sometimes wept, said the thing that needed saying, and dismissed him with dignity. He left feeling like he'd won a sermon. She left knowing she had a country to steer. It was a clash of styles, if not immediate policies. Two people who liked absolutes in a time that needed artful compromise. And then the tall boy, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He arrived in 1565 with all the right names folded into his person like a complicated pastry. Half-tutor through his mother, Margaret Douglas, a Stuart on the Scottish side. It was dynastically genius. Marry your cousin who strengthens your claim to England and produces heirs that make your enemy's headaches worse. Contemporary accounts call him handsome, tall, well-proportioned, the kind of fashionable that isn't really fashion, it's youth. The problem wasn't measurements. The problem was content. He wanted the crown matrimonial, as in joint kingship, for life. Immediately, as if ordering dessert before the main course. He sulked, he mishandled sighing, he drank. For a court raised on Valois polish, Darnley felt like a badly written sequel. Mary married him anyway, July 1565, Hollywood. Advisors frowned. She was queen. Queens sometimes choose the person who looks like the solution everyone will understand on paper. Her half-brother, James Stuart, Merrow Earl of Moray, refused the marriage and led the Chaseabout Raid, a rebellion with a name that says everything. Lots of writing, not a lot of victory. Mary rode too, with the kind of energy people remember, and the rebels found themselves inconveniently unsupported. Moray slipped out of the country with the practiced shuffle of men who lived long by leaving when necessary. Back in Edinburgh, the domestic project didn't improve. Darnley kept pressing for the crown matrimonial. The council kept offering him polite reasons and unpolite stares. He found other resentments to keep him warm. One name that kept returning was David Rizzio. The Scots would say Rizzio, but most historians have gone with the Italiano. Rizzio was very good at calendars and compliments and knew which documents required which hands. Rizzio's closeness to Mary and his closeness to influence bothered men who preferred influence to be born in Scotland with a sword attached. Darnley, jealous and easily recruited by men with longer grudges, joined a plan. In March 1566, during a supper at Holyrood, Rizzio was dragged from the Queen's presence and killed next door. We'll keep it quiet. No details needed. Mary was pregnant. She looked at Darnley with the kind of calm that frightened other people and began immediately the work of getting out of the trap. That she did within days is one of those undersung moments. Her capacity to remain composed while the men around her discovered they had miscalculated spectacularly.
June 1566 brought better light. James, future James VI, was born in Edinburgh Castle, a healthy boy. The guns fired in the nice way. The country exhaled into another cradle. Darnley achieved the briefest moment of grace by being father to a king. It didn't last. He fell ill later in 1566. Glasgow letters preserve the mood. Smallpox, said some. Syphilis, guessed others. General consequences of being Darnley, suggested those with louder eyebrows. Mary visited him in the kind of dutiful way that makes a closet full of courtiers rethink their gossip. She had him brought to Edinburgh to convalesce at a house near St. Mary in the Fields, Kirk o' Field. It was close to the palace and could be made more or less secure. It was February 1567. The house exploded in the night. Darnley was found in the garden, not burned. We'll respect your sleep and not run too far ahead. The official answers were unconvincing. The unofficial ones were busy. There's no restful way to narrate the next months, so we'll do it carefully. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, started featuring with the persistence of a recurring character who knows the writers. He was powerful, unsentimental, and better at logistics than charm. He was tried for Darnley's murder and acquitted so quickly the calendar blushed. He convened leading nobles in the Ainsley Tavern and collected their signatures on a bond supporting him as a suitable husband for the Queen. Some signed willingly, some signed because not signing in a room with Bothwell was a poor long-term health plan. Then the abduction. In late April 1567, Mary was intercepted by Bothwell while riding near Almond Bridge and taken to Dunbar. Was it violent? Was it staged? Was it an arrangement framed as force to give Mary cover for a decision she felt trapped into making? Historians arrange themselves in tidy rows over this question and try not to raise their voices. What's agreed is that she married Bothwell in May 1567 after he divorced his wife, Jean Gordon. It was a Protestant ceremony first, then possibly a Catholic adjustment for Mary's conscience. The optics were poor. The populace did not like it. The nobles who had signed the Ainsley bond suddenly remembered other commitments. Bothwell was the kind of man who looked like a solution until he didn't. June brought Carberry Hill, one of those encounters where everyone would prefer the other side to stand down politely. Mary appeared with Bothwell. Opposite them, a confederation of lords with patience for everything except Bothwell. Negotiations drifted. In the end, Mary surrendered on condition that Bothwell be allowed to leave the field. He did, heading toward the kind of exile that looks like a faded drawing. She was led to Edinburgh and then to Lochleven Castle, an island prison with nice views and poor visitor policies. In July, she miscarried twins, if we trust the reports. She signed an abdication in favor of baby James. The infant, not yet one, was crowned at Stirling. James Stuart, Earl of Moray, Mary's half-brother, a man with a steady hand and a resume for this, accepted the regency. The country, briefly, felt like it had swapped out the drama for a plan. Mary escaped in May 1568. Guards are fallible, and islands have boats. George Douglas, related to the house you already know too well, helped. She crossed the loch at night and rode, because writing solves so many immediate problems. Her banners gathered again. Loyalists assembled. A reconciliation felt possible in that afternoon way. At Langside, near Glasgow, the rebel lords, commanded by the regent's people, met her supporters. The fight was fast. Her side lost. She fled south. What else does a queen do when home won't hold her? She asks her cousin for help.
Elizabeth I received a letter and then a person. Mary crossed into England expecting hospitality at scale, the kind owed to a fellow queen in distress. She found process. Elizabeth wasn't ready to send a rival with a claim stronger than she liked to France, where the Guises might use her like a banner. She wasn't ready to send her back to Scotland, where Mary's presence would split a realm Elizabeth preferred orderly. So Mary entered a house, then another house, then another. It was called protective custody. It looked like a long, careful cage with embroidery, dogs, and a lot of reading. We'll pause right at that threshold, the beginning of Mary's English years, because the rest is a slow, layered story. Ciphers and curtains, letters that may or may not be genuine, conversations with wardens about windows, the habit of making gardens bloom when you can't walk in fields, and the way a person turns into a symbol when no one will let her be a person. It includes honest kindnesses from women who saw a human being trapped in a policy. It includes plots with names. It ends with a room at Foderhigh in 1587 that we'll only visit with the lights very low. Before we dim for tonight, a few soft portraits from this part, because details matter in quiet history. 1. Elizabeth's dogs. She kept small ones and loved them as you'd expect in a life of constant traveling theaters. In one famous inn note, a little dog hid in her skirts at Foderhigh. The animal model of loyalty outperformed the human one, as usual. 2. The Four Marys. Beaton and Seton stayed especially close. They were the kind of friends who know which look to give you before the tear falls. When Mary was wide awake at 3 a.m. planning how to escape a lake, those were the faces that appeared when she needed rope.
The rooms. She brought French taste to Scottish stone. She hung small tapestries at angles that made smoke behave. She played the lute. She wrote poems with that blend of sincerity and posture that keeps graduate students employed. John Knox and the interviews. She cried once. He told her he wasn't moved. She kept talking anyway.
If you ever need to imagine the Reformation in an allegory, a woman who loved ceremony making a case for private conscience against a man who loved truth more than conversation. The letters, folded small, some in cipher, some in straight talk, some later called the casket letters, which is an entire graduate seminar on its own. Did she write them to Bothwell? Were they forged? Historians choose their seats and look across at each other with the soft sigh of people who know they'll never be invited to the primary source party. One last street-level picture. August 1561. Leith. Fog lifting. A woman steps off a ship in mourning clothes. She'll lighten later. The town is untidy in the normal way. Ropes, barrels, children being children. People press forward to see the queen they've only heard about in other languages. She looks at them with the soft smile people use when their stomach is doing things and they don't want to show it. The city smells of malt and sea and opportunity. She climbs into a saddle. The church bells don't ring at her request because even she understands that the city needs quiet more than it needs announcements. She rides to Holy Rood and begins the careful business of trying to be herself in a room set up for someone else's story. Next time, we'll keep it low. Mary in England, years measured in letters and steps between windows. Elizabeth's caution, plots that used her name like a tool. Embroidery as both occupation and manifesto. And that last winter when patience ran out. For now, let the sea flatten to slate. Let Holy Rood's light dim to a line. And let the story rest on the threshold of a door that opens into a long hallway with many careful locks. Hey again, lights dimmed, kettle doing its thing. We're taking the soft road into 20 years of rooms with locks. No drums, just paper, embroidery, a lot of letters, and a queen who learned every step of waiting. We left Mary at the English border in 1568, having ridden south after Langside because bad options sometimes come labeled hospitality. Elizabeth I, the cousin, the rival, the woman with a crown Mary might eventually inherit if dynastic math got bored, was not in a hosting mood. She liked Mary better as an unsolved problem than as a guest, so the welcome came with a password, and an escort, and a door that swung one way. The first lodgings were at Carlisle, then Bolton. Those early months had the feel of a polite party where no one is allowed to leave the sitting room. Sir Francis Knollys, Elizabeth's cousin by marriage, handled Mary with firm courtesy. He found her charming and alarming in equal measures. He wrote about her personality with the kind of careful admiration you use when you suspect your spymaster is reading your compliments. Officialdom tried to make the whole situation look like a legal exercise. The English council convened conferences at York and Westminster to examine Mary's conduct in Scotland, specifically Darnley's murder, the Bothwell marriage, and whether Mary had essentially disqualified herself as queen. The Scottish regent Moray arrived with the famous casket letters, supposed love letters from Mary to Bothwell that, if authentic, made everything look warmed over. If forged, convenient. The originals have not survived. Copies did the rounds. Mary refused to submit to any tribunal that treated her like a subject rather than a sovereign. She denied writing the letters. The English commissioners sniffed at the papers, sniffed at Mary's refusals, and produced no verdict. Which was the point. A verdict would have required action. No verdict meant Mary remained a problem in a controlled environment. Elizabeth preferred problems she could move between castles. The wider country was less calm. In the north of England, Catholic earls, Northumberland and Westmoreland, rose in 1569, waving the old faith and the idea of rescuing Mary. It was not subtle. Banners, proclamations, and a vague plan to march south and find a better century. It ended with sudden speed and gallows work. As a consequence, Mary was moved farther from sympathetic shires to places with colder stone. Tutbury, Wingfield, Chatsworth, Sheffield. The last two belonged to the Earl of Shrewsbury and his very capable wife, Bess of Hardwicke, who could balance accounts by thinking at them. Mary lived, often in their keeping, for the better part of 15 years. You could call it house arrest. You could also call it a slow domestic siege conducted with damask tablecloths.
The Shrewsbury marriage eroded in this period. That much is not debated. Bess and Mary were sometimes allies, sometimes orbiting knives. Bess loved building houses and lineages. Mary loved conversation and sympathy. Both loved relevance. Gossip did lapse. Some said Mary had charmed the Earl beyond healthy limits. Others said Bess invented that to leverage a divorce. There's a rumor about Mary birthing an illegitimate child during captivity. File it under sensational claims with bad footnotes. No reliable evidence. What we have is heavy correspondence, strained budgets, too many fabrics, and too strong women trapped in the same social aquarium. Mary's daily life settled into a rhythm that would kill most modern souls and somehow kept hers afloat. Needlework, hours upon hours, spun into tapestries and panels full of symbolism. She embroidered emblems with quiet claws, a cat crouching over a mouse, a phoenix rising, mottos like "En ma fin est mon commencement," "In my end is my beginning," stitched like a whisper to herself and to anyone with eyes. Bess of Hardwicke stitched with her. Later, some of these works would hang in Oxburgh, a museum of patience and coded feelings. It is underappreciated how much of early modern politics was conducted with silk and thread. Letters moved as tirelessly as fingers. Mary wrote to her Guise relatives in France, to Spanish diplomats, to the Pope, to Scottish lords she still thought could be reclaimed, to her son's guardians, to anyone who might pick up a corner and lift. She wrote to Elizabeth in carefully courteous folds, calling her sister, and asked to meet, to talk, to be heard as a fellow queen rather than as a file. Elizabeth avoided the face-to-face as if it were contagious. She preferred hearsay to tears. It was safer. Around Mary, the air thickened with plots. Some came with her name attached, whether she had lifted a pen or not. 1571 brought the Ridolfi plot, a plan to marry Mary to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, land Spanish troops, shuffle thrones, and imagine that everyone would approve. Norfolk agreed to too many things in too many letters. He lost his head for it in 1572. Mary didn't. Elizabeth flinched at beheading an anointed cousin, but the leash shortened. Locks got heavier. Ink got watched. 1570 also added fuel to an already hot room. Pope Pius V issued Regnans in Excelsis, excommunicating Elizabeth and releasing her subjects from obedience. The theology was a gift to Mary's enemies and friends alike. Now it wasn't just politics, it was spiritual paperwork. Mary, a Catholic queen in a Protestant-ruled house, became the magnetic north of every discontented compass. That wasn't her fault. It wasn't not useful to men with plans.
In 1583, more threads twisted into the Throckmorton plot, continental invasion plus domestic ignition, allegedly featuring the Spanish ambassador Mendoza and the Guise Circle. It fizzled into arrests and a new invention. Elizabeth's council drafted the Bond of Association in 1584. You sign, promising that if anyone attempted the Queen's life and you stood to gain from it, you would be cut out of history on principle. Mary signed, which is the kind of move you make when every refusal is turned into an admission. Parliament made it into law the next year. Act for the Queen's Safety, basically a legislative mousetrap set under Mary's chair. By 1585, Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's principal secretary and spy master, stopped trusting chance. He preferred engineering. Mary was moved again, this time under Ammius Paulet and Sir Drew Drury, who were allergic to comfort. Tutbury's damp returned. Windows got meaner. Food got measured. Walsingham made sure Mary's correspondence routes were secured in the spy master sense of the word, a secret channel via a brewer that was less secret than it looked. Letters hidden in beer barrels and corks have a certain charm until you realize your mailman works for the other team. Enter Anthony Babington, a young Derbyshire gentleman with an appetite for conspiracies and an unsteady relationship with discretion. In 1586, encouraged by go-betweens with Walsingham's fingerprints all over their souls, Babington wrote to Mary laying out a plan: rescue you, kill Elizabeth, invite a Catholic invasion, remake the map, Crown Day. Walsingham's cryptanalyst Thomas Phillips opened and read the letters, then resealed them. He encouraged the conversation to develop like a careful gardener leads a vine. Mary's reply in July 1586 is one of those documents that historians reread with a mixture of dread and doubt. In it, after urging caution and care, she appears to consent to the dispatch of the usurper. Whether that meant assassination and whether the wording was manipulated will keep seminar rooms warm forever. What mattered to Walsingham is that he had enough to spring the trap he had set. Babington and his friends were arrested in August. The executions that followed were designed to discourage future playwrights. Mary's secretaries, Claude Now and Gilbert Curl, were seized, their ciphers cracked, their loyalty turned into evidence. Mary herself was moved fast to Fotheringham in Northamptonshire, an old royal pile reactivated for the kind of proceeding that prefers old stones. Her trial in October 1586 was theater with Latin footnotes. Commissioners, peers, privy councillors, legal heavyweights arrived to do sober faces at long tables. Mary refused to acknowledge the court's jurisdiction because she was a queen, not an English subject. Then, because not speaking would serve her less, she spoke anyway. She argued facts and principles. She pointed out that entrapment is still entrapment even when the paperwork is neat. She denied ordering assassination. She admitted wanting out. She asked politely and persistently to face her accusers. The commissioners listened the way people listen when they know the tune already.
The verdict arrived with that cold efficiency the state can manage when it wants quiet. Guilty. Parliament petitioned Elizabeth for execution. Elizabeth sighed theatrically, as was her right, and practiced her favorite mode, indecision with teeth. She delayed, consulted, scolded, pressed, stalled. Eventually, in February 1587, she signed the death warrant and handed it to her secretary Davison with enough ambiguity to blame him later. The council moved with relief. They sent it. Elizabeth would punish Davison for doing exactly what she and her council had engineered, because politics loves a scapegoat. We keep this gentle. On February 8th, 1587, Mary walked to the Great Hall at Fotheringham. She wore black, with red underneath, martyr's color for Catholics, a quiet sermon about how she chose to be remembered. She spoke well. She forgave the men with the axes, as queens do when they understand those men have bosses too. There are details people repeat because they make the scene resonate. The little dog hidden in her skirts, refusing to leave her. The first blow not quite finishing it. The second finding its mark. The wig slipping when the head was lifted, because human vanity is the gravity of every era. We will not linger. The important thing for us is the line Mary wrote, stitched, and lived. In my end is my beginning. Elizabeth pretended to be furious. She wrote to James VI in Scotland with the tone of a woman who had just been tragically outmaneuvered by her own council. James answered with measured grievance and immediate calculation. He wanted the English succession. Elizabeth knew it. He knew she knew it. He did not declare war for a mother he had last seen at 10 months old. He filed the emotion and signed the practical papers. Treaty of Berwick, 1586, his alliance with Elizabeth, had already set his path. The cold arithmetic of kingship devoured the warmer math of grief.
Let's float sideways for a moment, the people who filled Mary's waiting years with texture. Sir Amias Powlett,
agonized about conscience, refused to poison Mary when Walsingham politely hinted at shortcuts. He wanted legality, not stains. Bess of Hardwick, tougher than oak, turned her needlework into a personality. She and Mary stitched together and apart, their panels full of birds who had opinions. The Earl of Shrewsbury grew gray hosting captivity. His marriage to Bess splintered under the stress of having a queen at their table who refused to behave like a static piece of furniture. Thomas Phelps drew little gallows on margins like a man who understood that his work would never have statues. And what about Scotland while Mary paced? It kept moving. Regents and factions and schedules. Murray, capable, cool, was shot dead in 1570 by a Hamilton assassin. Other regents followed. Lennox, Mar, Morton. Morton, the most competent and most disliked, ended under the Maiden, the Scottish guillotine, ironically a device he had helped introduce. James VI grew into the game with the cat-like caution of a boy raised by accidents. He practiced friendliness with an English accent. He learned to live with letters that began "Your mother" and ended in requests he couldn't afford to grant. He learned that outrage is a currency you spend only when it buys you something permanent.
If you want one more small picture of Mary's captivity to hold on to, choose this. Sheffield Manor Lodge. Winter. Stones sweating. The Queen sits with a cloth on her lap. Her hands are steady, because practice makes most things so. She is sewing a phoenix, its wings bright, its eye fixed. Next to it she works a cat, paws ready, a little too large for the mouse it watches. She isn't writing a letter. She's writing a sentence only people with time will read. Her ladies murmur, someone counts stitches. A dog sighs in its sleep. Outside, the English state does what states do, files, stamps, and waits for a convenient day. From the beginning of our walk, Edinburgh, 1440, to this quiet hall, the thread has been the same, and we ought to tug it gently. Hospitality used as a weapon makes every later invitation heavier. The Black Dinner taught that lesson to a generation it took decades to unlearn. Mary learned it again at a national scale. She asked for safety and got process. She asked for a hearing and got walls. She asked for a meeting and got couriers. No one could say she wasn't fed. No one could say she was free. We can end this part with 3 soft vignettes because bedtime prefers the human scale. In a small room at Tutbury, Mary's dog stands on a stool to watch her write. The candle gutters. She shields it with her hand. The shadow on the wall looks like a crown. It's just her sleeve. In a clerk's office in London, Walsingham massages his temples while Philippes unfolds another letter. The ink smells sharp. They know they are doing something without statues. They also know it will work. In Stirling, a young James reads a message from England and lays it under a paperweight. He looks out at a gray morning and decides, again, not to be dramatic. He is not a sentimental man. He is a patient one. History will give him what he wants if he behaves. Next time, we can let the lamps burn low for the last little walk. How James VI navigated factions and theology and personal oddities. How he crossed a border without anyone raising a banner in anger, and how a century and a half of dinners, behaviors, and sorting things out ended with one crown sitting on 2 heads. We'll keep it soft as always. For now, let the needle rest, let the door stay closed, and let the letters fold themselves into sleep.